Imagine standing on a narrow ridge of stone, higher than the clouds themselves, in the first grey light before dawn. The air up here is thin and cold and utterly still. Far below you, an ocean of white mist fills the valleys, moving slowly, the way water moves when it has nowhere it needs to be. Sharp green peaks rise out of that mist like islands, and somewhere beneath your feet, laid out across this impossible ridge, there is a city of pale grey stone. Terraces stepping down the mountainside in long, patient curves. Doorways that frame the sunrise. Walls built of stones so perfectly fitted that, 500 years later, you still could not slide a blade of grass between them. No one has lived here for centuries, and yet nothing has fallen. The mist drifts through the empty doorways, as if the city were only sleeping, as if the people who built it had simply stepped out one morning and would be back before dark. This is the world of the Inca, the greatest empire the Americas ever knew. An empire that rose in barely 100 years, in the thin cold air of the Andes, among the highest mountains on earth. An empire that built 10,000 miles of roads without the wheel, kept the records of 10 million people without writing, and raised cities in the clouds without iron tools, and then vanished, in a handful of years, so suddenly that the world has been trying to understand it ever since. Tonight, this is the story we will follow, slowly, gently, from the very beginning to the very end. Before we set out on this long road together, a quiet word, and only if these journeys are truly yours. If these voyages into the ancient world have become part of your nights, a gentle press of the like button helps this story find other travelers like you. If you would like these journeys to continue, following the channel means you will be here when the next one begins. And if you feel so inclined, leave a word below, just your city, and the hour where you are. It is a quietly wonderful thing to see how far across the sleeping world these stories reach. Lima or London, Chicago or Cairo, you are welcome here, traveler. All of you are. And now, the journey. Tonight we will wander far. We will begin long before the Inca themselves, in the deep past of the Andes, among peoples whose names are older than memory. We will hear the legend of the children of the sun, who rose out of a lake with a golden staff, searching for the place where the world should begin. We will watch a small valley kingdom called Cusco survive a war it should have lost, and rise, under a prince called the Earth Shaker, into an empire that stretched along the spine of a continent. We will walk the great stone roads that ran for thousands of miles through impossible country, and follow the relay runners who carried the emperor's words faster than any horse. We will learn the secret of the quipu, the knotted cords that remembered everything, though not a single word was ever written down. We will stand before walls that earthquakes cannot shake, and ask, honestly, how they were made. For there is much here that scholars still debate, and we will not pretend to certainties that do not exist. We will climb, at last, to the estate in the clouds that the world now calls Machu Picchu, and meet the golden temple of the sun and the mummified kings who ruled on, long after death, from their palaces in Cusco. And then, gently, we will follow the story into its long twilight. The plague that arrived before the strangers did. The two royal brothers who broke the empire between them. The afternoon in a mountain square called Cajamarca, when a few hundred men from across the sea brought down the greatest power in the Americas. The room filled once with gold and twice with silver. The last free kingdom, hidden in the jungle at Vilcabamba. And the ending that was not quite an ending, because the people of the Andes were never lost. Millions of them are there tonight, speaking the old language, working the old terraces, beneath the same sun. It is a story of mountains and mist, of stone that does not move, and an empire that moved too fast. Of how much can be built in a single century, and how much can be lost in a single afternoon, and of what, in the end, endures. The mist is beginning to thin now, there on the high ridge. The first gold light is touching the peaks, one by one, the way a lamplighter moves down a long street. Somewhere below, the great story is waiting to begin. In a land that existed long, long before anyone had ever spoken the word Inca. Let us go down into the valleys and begin. To understand the Inca, you must first understand their land, because there is no other land like it on earth, and no other empire was ever asked to solve the problems it poses. Picture the western edge of South America. Along the coast runs a desert, one of the driest places in the world, a pale ribbon of sand and stone, where in some places rain has not fallen in living memory. And yet this desert is threaded with green. Dozens of small rivers come down from the mountains, and wherever a river touches the sand, there is a valley of fields and villages, like beads on a string. Beyond the beaches, the cold Pacific current fills the sea with fish, one of the richest fisheries on the planet, pressed up against one of its emptiest deserts. Then, behind the coast, the wall begins. The Andes, the longest mountain range on Earth, and outside of Asia, the highest. The mountains rise not as a single line, but as parallel ranges, chord after chord of peaks, with high cold plateaus slung between them. Up here the air is thin, water boils before it is truly hot. Nights fall below freezing even in summer, and the sun in the daytime is close, and sharp, and bright. At the heart of it lies the Altiplano, the high plain, a world of golden grass and enormous skies, more than 12,000 feet above the sea, where the great lake called Titicaca lies like a sheet of hammered silver, so large that the far shore drops below the horizon. And then, on the eastern side, the world falls. The mountains plunge down into cloud forest, steep green slopes wrapped in perpetual mist, where orchids grow on every branch, and below that, stretching away toward the sunrise, the vast green ocean of the Amazon, desert, mountain, and jungle. 3 worlds, pressed against each other, sometimes within a single day's walk. The people of the Andes learned, over thousands of years, to live not in one of these worlds, but in all of them at once. A single community might keep fields at half a dozen different altitudes, cotton and chili peppers in the warm low valleys, maize on the middle slopes, potatoes on the cold heights, and herds of llama and alpaca on the high grasslands above everything. Scholars call this the vertical archipelago, a way of life built like a ladder, rung upon rung, up the side of the world. It was a hard land, and an honest one. It gave nothing away. Every field on those slopes had to be carved, walled and watered by hand, and the land moved. This is one of the most seismically restless places on the planet. The ground itself, every so often, would shrug, and everything not built with patience and humility would come down. So the Andes taught their people 3 lessons, over and over, for thousands of years before the Inca were ever heard of. They taught cooperation, because no family alone could build a canal, or terrace a mountainside, or shear a herd. Work was something owed and shared, woven between families and villages like thread on a loom. They taught storage, because in a land of frost and drought, the difference between a bad year and a catastrophe was what you had set aside. And they taught reverence, because when you live among peaks that touch the sky, glaciers that feed your rivers, and ground that trembles, you do not think of the land as a thing. You think of it as alive. The mountains were Apus, lords. The earth was Pachamama, the mother. These were not distant gods, but neighbors, watching, provident, and owed respect. Hold this picture, as we go forward. An immense vertical land, communities bound together by shared labor, storehouses against the hungry season, and mountains that were alive, because everything the Inca would one day build, the roads, the terraces, the storehouses that fed millions, the temples on the peaks, every piece of it grew out of these old Andean lessons. The Inca did not invent this world. They inherited it, from peoples far older than themselves, and then they organized it, on a scale no one in the Americas had ever imagined. But that is getting ahead of the story, because long before Cusco was anything more than a village among villages, the valleys and deserts of this land had already raised civilizations, grown them, flowered them, and let them fade, for 4,000 years. The Inca were not the beginning. They were the last chapter of a very old book. It is to those first chapters that we turn now. Down on the desert coast, in the shadow of the mountains, where the oldest city in the Americas was rising, while the pyramids of Egypt were still new, 5,000 years ago, while the first pharaohs were raising their monuments beside the Nile, and the cities of Sumer were young. Something remarkable was happening in a dry river valley on the coast of Peru. At a place now called Corral, people were building a city. Plazas, platform mounds the height of temples, sunken circular courts where crowds once gathered. It is, as far as we know, the oldest city in all the Americas, and it rose with no pottery, no writing, and no war that archaeologists can find. No fortress walls, no weapons in the ruins. What they find instead are flutes, made from the bones of pelicans and condors. A city of music, it seems, and trade, and ceremony, thriving on fish from the sea and cotton from the fields. We know almost nothing of what these people believed, or what language they spoke, or what they called themselves. Their city flourished for the better part of 1,000 years, and then, Quietly, it was given back to the desert, and this became the rhythm of the Andes. Over the next 4,000 years, civilizations rose in these valleys and highlands, flowered and faded, one after another, like waves arriving on that cold Pacific shore. We will walk through them gently, for their names deserve to be spoken. Around 3,000 years ago, in the northern highlands, there arose a temple called Chavin di Wanta, a place of pilgrimage set where two rivers meet. Pilgrims came to it across enormous distances. They entered a labyrinth, stone passageways, underground, dark and narrow, filled with the roar of channeled water and, perhaps, the smoke and visions of ritual. And in the deepest chamber, lit by a shaft of light, stood a granite blade of a god, a towering carved figure, part human, part fanged feline, part serpent, which has stood in that same spot, in the dark, for nearly 3,000 years. It is still there tonight. Chavin was not an empire. It conquered no one. It was an idea, a shared vision of the sacred that spread across the Andes and knit distant peoples together, perhaps for the first time. Centuries later, on the southern desert coast, came the Nazca, the people of the lines. On the flat desert pavement they drew, by sweeping aside the dark surface stones, images so vast they can only truly be seen from the air. A hummingbird longer than a football field, a monkey with a spiraling tail, a condor, whales, spiders, flowers, and hundreds of long, ruler-straight lines running to the horizon. Why? We must be honest, as we always will be on these journeys. No one knows for certain. Perhaps they were pathways for ritual processions, walked in ceremony. Perhaps they pointed to water, or to the mountains that sent it. Perhaps they were meant for the eyes of the gods alone. The desert has kept them perfectly, and kept their secret too. And in the north, in the green river valleys, the Moshe built pyramids of sun-dried brick, millions upon millions of bricks, and filled their world with art. Their potters were among the finest the ancient world ever produced, anywhere. They portrayed everything: warriors and weavers, healers and musicians, the faces of individual people so alive, so particular, that looking at them feels like meeting someone. When archaeologists opened the untouched tomb of one of their great lords, the Lord of Sipan, they found him arrayed in gold and turquoise, attended in death by his companions, as rich as any tomb Egypt ever yielded. Rise and flower and fade. The Moshe declined amid decades of catastrophic weather, great cycles of flood and drought sent by the warming and cooling of that same Pacific Sea. The Nazca faded, new peoples rose in their places, and through all of it, the deep Andean lessons were being learned and relearned, refined and passed down. The terraces, the canals, the shared labor, the stored surplus, the reverence for mountain and earth, nothing was wasted. Everything was inherited. Each of these worlds laid down another layer of knowledge, like sediment in a riverbed, and the peoples who came after built upon it. And around 1,400 years ago, on the cold high plain near Lake Titicaca, and in the mountains to the north, two powers arose that would carry this inheritance further than anyone before them. Not cities now, but something new in the Andes, something with reach. The first true empires were coming. On the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, more than 12,000 feet above the sea, there stands a ruin that the Inca themselves regarded with awe. When the first Inca emperors came to this place, and they made a point of coming, they found vast stone platforms, monolithic gateways cut from single blocks of volcanic rock, and colossal stone figures staring out across the high plain with wide, unblinking eyes. The Inca said that this place had been built at the beginning of the world. They called the site holy, and they wove it into their own story. Near here, they said, the creator god Viracocha had called forth the sun, the moon, and the stars, and had made the first peoples of the earth. The place is called Tiwanaku, and though it was not built at the dawn of the world, it is old. Its greatness lies 1,000 years and more before the Inca. At its height, Tiwanaku was one of the highest cities ever raised by humankind, a ceremonial capital of platforms and sunken courts, of gateways aligned to the sky, home to tens of thousands. Its farmers fed it through genius, raised fields built out into the shallows of the lake, ridges of earth separated by channels of water that soaked up the fierce daytime sun and released the warmth at night, wrapping the crops in a blanket of mild air against the killing frost. On the roof of the world, they had engineered a climate. Tiwanaku's power was not, so far as we can tell, primarily the power of the sword. It spread through faith and trade and llama caravans that moved down to the coast and out to the valleys, carrying textiles, obsidian, maize beer for the great gathering feasts, and above all carrying prestige. To be tied to Tiwanaku was to be tied to the center of the sacred world, and at almost the same time, away in the mountains to the north, a different kind of power was rising. It was called Wari, and where Tiwanaku persuaded, Wari organized. The Wari were empire builders in a way the Andes had never quite seen. From their sprawling stone capital they reached out along the mountain spine, and where they went, they built. And what they built should sound familiar. Roads, engineered and maintained, linking province to province. Administrative centers laid out on planned grids, rising in conquered valleys like government stamps upon the land. Terraced hillsides on a massive scale, storehouses, and knotted cords for keeping accounts. An early form of the device the Inca would one day perfect and call the quipu. Listen to that list again. Roads, provincial centers, terraces, state storehouses, knotted cord records. Every one of these, the Inca would inherit, refine, and expand to a scale the Wari never dreamed of. Much of what the world thinks of as the Inca genius was, in truth, the old genius of the Andes, and the Wari were its great systematicize. The Inca themselves would have found nothing insulting in this. In the Andes, the past was not something you replaced. It was something you continued. For centuries, these two powers, Wari in the northern mountains, Tiwanaku on the southern lake, divided the high world between them. They traded, they watched each other, they shared gods and symbols. Whether they ever fought, we honestly do not know. And then, around 1,000 years ago, both of them failed. The causes are debated, as the fall of great powers always is, but the sky itself seems to have turned against them. The evidence of ice cores and lake beds speaks of a long grinding drought settling over the southern Andes, decades upon decades of failing rain. The raised fields of Tiwanaku, starved of water, went barren. The great feasts that bound the provinces together could not be paid for. Wari's centers were abandoned one by one, some with their doorways deliberately sealed, as if their people expected one day to return. They never did. What followed was a long twilight, several centuries of fragmentation, of local lords in hilltop forts, of small peoples raiding and feuding where great states had once kept the peace. The old knowledge survived. The terraces, the roads, the cords, the crafts. But the order was gone. The Andes had become a land of 100 quarreling valleys, waiting, though none of them knew it, for someone to gather the pieces. In one of those valleys, high in the southern mountains, there was a small town of no particular importance. Its neighbors were stronger than it was. No one outside its own valley had any reason to know its name. The town was called Cusco, and it is time we told the story its people told, of a golden staff, a journey, and the children of the sun. Every empire tells a story about where it came from. The Roman told of twins raised by a wolf. The Inca told of a golden staff. This is how they told it. In the courts of Cusco, on the great festival days, in the versions that were recited to the Spanish chroniclers who wrote them down when everything else was ending. And as we listen, let us hold it the way the Inca held it. Not as a report, but as a truth deeper than fact. A story about who they believed they were. In the beginning, the story says, the world was in darkness, and the peoples of the earth lived without order, without towns, without fields, without cloth, scattered across the mountains like stones. And Inti, the sun, looked down upon this darkness and took pity on it. So the sun created 2 children, a son, Manco Capac, and a daughter, Mama Oclo. Some tellings say they rose out of the waters of Lake Titicaca, that immense silver lake on the roof of the world, beside the ancient ruins of Tiwanaku, the place where the world itself was said to have begun. And the sun gave his children a rod of gold and a task. Go out into the world, he told them. Wherever you stop to rest, test the ground, thrust the golden staff into the earth, where the soil is so deep and so fertile that the staff sinks and disappears with a single thrust. There you will found a city. There the world will begin again. And so they walked, northward from the lake, through the cold high grasslands, down along the Cordillera, stopping, testing, moving on. The staff struck stone. The staff struck thin, bitter soil. They kept walking. It is a long way from Titicaca to Cusco, hundreds of miles through some of the highest inhabited country on earth, and the story lets them walk all of it, because a world is not founded in a hurry. Until one day they came down into a valley, high and green, folded between mountains, with a river running through it. And Manco Capac drew back the golden staff and drove it into the earth. and the earth received it whole. The staff sank from sight, as if the valley itself had swallowed it in welcome. Here then, this valley, this exact place and no other, chosen by the sun and confirmed by the earth. They called it Cusco, and the Inca would say the name meant the navel, the center, the point from which the whole world radiates, and the children of the sun set to work, not as conquerors in this telling, but as teachers. Manco Capac taught the men the arts of civilization, to break the ground and channel the water, to build in stone, to plant maize. Mama Oclo taught the women to spin and weave, and let us pause on that, because in the Andes weaving was no small domestic craft. Cloth was wealth, cloth was language, cloth was power. A fine textile was worth more than gold. In giving weaving to Mama Oclo, the story places a woman at the very foundation of everything the Inca valued most. That is the legend. Now let us be honest with each other, as we promised to be. Behind the golden staff, archaeology tells a quieter story. There was no sudden founding. The valley of Cusco had been farmed for thousands of years before the Inca. Villages had risen and merged and grown. The people we call the Inca were, at first, simply one highland community among many, herders and farmers of the valley, speaking their language, honoring their mountains, indistinguishable to any passing traveller from a dozen neighbouring peoples. But notice what the legend does. It reaches back to Titicaca, to the oldest sacred place in the Andes, the ruins the Inca themselves gazed at in wonder, and it draws a golden thread from that deep past directly to Cusco. It says, "We are not new. We are the continuation of everything that came before. The old world's holiness flows to us." And it says one thing more, the most important thing of all. The ruler of Cusco is not merely a king. He is Sapa Inca, the unique Inca, a child of the sun itself, descended in an unbroken golden line from Manco Capac. To obey him was not politics, it was piety. Every road the Inca would build, every war they would fight, every stone they would raise, rested finally on that single, luminous claim. For generations after the legendary founding, the rulers of Cusco remained small lords in a small valley. Kings, their descendants would insist, but kings of very little. The staff was planted, the line was founded, but the empire was still asleep, and it would take a catastrophe to wake it. Let us come down out of legend now, and stand in the Cusco of 600 years ago, the real town, in the decades before everything changed. It would not have impressed you, a modest settlement of fieldstone and thatch, folded into the head of its green valley, 11,000 feet above the sea. Smoke rising from cooking fires in the thin morning air, terraced fields stepping up the hillsides, llama trains picking their way down the paths, the smell of wood smoke and rain and turned earth, a place of perhaps a few thousand souls, a market town, a chief's seat, one small polity among the dozens scattered through the southern highlands in the long fragmented twilight after the fall of Wari. The Inca of these generations were ruled by their curicas, their lords, the men remembered later as the early kings, and the politics of their world were the politics of every small valley in the Andes, marriage alliances with the neighbours across the ridge, feasting, cattle raids, or rather llama raids, skirmishes over water and land, oaths sworn and broken and sworn again. Power in this world was personal. A lord was as strong as the kinsmen who owed him loyalty, and the allies who owed him favours. When a strong lord died, his network died with him, and his heir began again nearly from nothing. Around Cusco, in every direction stood peoples who considered themselves at least its equals, and some who were certainly its betters. Away to the northwest, beyond the mountains, lay the rising power of the Chanca Confederacy, a warlike alliance of highland peoples, proud, expansionist and hungry. To the south, around the shores of Titicaca, the wealthy lordships of the Colla and Lupaca commanded herds of llama and alpaca, so vast they darkened the hillsides, the true wealth of the high plain. In the trench of the sacred valley, and in every side valley beyond it, sat smaller peoples, each with their hilltop forts, their shrines, their memories, their grudges. If, in those years, you had asked a well-travelled llama caravaner which of the highland powers would one day rule the world, swallow every rival, roads to the horizon in every direction, he would not have said Cusco. He might have laughed. The Chanca were stronger, the lords of the lake were richer. Cusco was respectable, no more. And yet, if you looked closely, the little kingdom had quiet advantages. Its valley was fertile and well-watered, a green bowl in the mountains that could feed more people than it held. It sat at a crossroads of natural routes, down to the sacred valley and the warm maize lands, south toward the lake, west toward the coast. Its lords had married patiently and widely, weaving Cusco into a web of kinship that stretched across the region. Its people carried the full Andean inheritance we have spoken of, the terraces, the canals, the storehouses, the discipline of shared labor, the memory, carried in stories from Titicaca that the world had once been organized and might be again. Cusco was, in short, a seed, compact, unremarkable, and full of everything needed for what was to come. But a seed does not become a tree because of what it contains. It becomes a tree when it is broken open. By the early 1400s, as the traditions tell it, the aging ruler of Cusco was a king called Viracocha Inca, who had taken, boldly, the name of the creator god himself. He had spent his life in the small wars of the valleys and won more than he lost. He had sons. The succession was, as always, a quiet knife fight of factions behind palace walls. His favoured heir was a prince called Urco, and there was another son, passed over, kept from favour, watching from the edges of the court. The traditions call him Kusi Yupanqui. Remember him, for away to the northwest, the Chanca had finished their long gathering of strength. Their war chiefs looked south and east across the mountains, at the fat valleys and the trade roads, at the respectable little kingdom that stood in their path. And somewhere in those years, the decision was made. The army that came together was, by every account, enormous, a moving city of warriors, porters and priests carrying the war idols of the Chanca ancestors before them. Their destination was Cusco, and nothing that lay in their path expected to survive them. The news came down the valleys ahead of the army, the way such news always travels, with refugees. The Chanca were coming, villages emptying before them, herds driven into the high pastures, smoke on the horizons to the northwest. Scouts brought back numbers that grew with every telling, and even the sober tellings were terrible. In Cusco, the traditions say, the response of the court was simple, and human, and shameful. The old king, Viracocha Inca, looked at what was coming, weighed his forces, and chose survival. With his heir Urco and the royal household, he withdrew from the city, up to a fortified refuge in the hills, and prepared, when the time came, to submit. It was not madness. Small kingdoms survived by bending. The Andes were full of lords who had knelt to stronger lords and kept their heads and most of their lands. Against the Chanca host, resistance looked very much like a decision to die. The city was to be abandoned to its fate, and most of Cusco's people, seeing their king's fires burning on the hillside above them, began to leave, but not everyone left. In the emptying city, a knot of resistance formed around the passed-over prince, Kusi Yupanqui, the son kept from favour. With him stood a handful of veteran captains, some of the priesthood, and whoever could be persuaded that a hopeless fight was better than surrender. The traditions give the prince a vision in those days, the creator god appearing to him beside a spring, promising him victory and glory beyond his imagining, if only he would stand. Whatever we make of visions, we may safely believe this much: that the prince chose to stand, and that the choice looked, to nearly everyone, like suicide. Messengers went out to the allied villages, to every lord who owed Cusco kinship or favour. Most calculated the odds and stayed home. They would kneel to the Chanca soon enough. Some few came, and with what he had, the prince armed the city, men and women both, the stories insist, and waited. The Chanca came down upon Cusco with their war idols carried before them, confident to the point of carelessness, and struck straight into the city. The fighting, the traditions say, ran through the streets and plazas themselves, close, desperate, and pitiless. The defenders were driven back and held, and were driven back again. The battle hung, hour upon hour, on the edge of ending, and it is here that the story lifts into legend, into the moment every Inca child would be told of for the next 100 years. At the last extremity, the prince called out to the very stones of the field, and the stones answered. The Puraraucas, the tales say, boulders and field stones that rose up from the earth in the shape of warriors and fell upon the Chanca flank. The enemy broke. The impossible battle was won. Did reinforcements arrive at the dying hour, looking to exhausted eyes like the earth itself coming to life? Did the defenders, fighting among the rocks and terraces they had known since childhood, simply outfight an overconfident enemy in ground of their own choosing? We cannot know, but here is what tells you everything about the Inca. Afterwards, They gathered stones from that battlefield, carried them into Cusco, and set them in shrines, honored as the actual warriors who had risen that day. The stones that saved the city. Stone. Again, always stone. Alive, loyal, and holy. What we can say with confidence is this: Cusco should have fallen, and did not. The Chanca were broken before its walls, pursued, and broken again in the campaigns that followed, until the confederacy that had terrified the highlands ceased to exist as a power. The victors took the Chanca war idols and set them too in Cusco, trophies of the day the world turned. Everything now belonged to the prince, not to the old king in his refuge, whose name was quietly folded into disgrace, not to Urco, the heir, who disappears from the traditions into defeat and death. The passed-over son had saved the city the king had abandoned, and no power in the valley could deny him now. He took the fringe of royalty and a new name, a name that was itself a declaration of what he intended to do to the world. He called himself Pachacuti, the Earthshaker, the overturner of the world, he who remakes everything. And he meant it, as the next 50 years were about to prove. History gives us, every so often, a figure who seems to compress the work of centuries into a single lifetime. The Andes had waited 400 years, since the fall of Wari, for someone to gather the broken pieces of the highland world. When the gathering came, it came in one man, in one reign, at a speed that still astonishes. Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui ruled, by the traditional reckoning, from around the year 1438, and within a single generation, the respectable little kingdom of Cusco became the greatest power the Americas had ever seen. The conquests came first, and they came like weather. The victory over the Chanca had done more than remove a rival. It had shattered the balance of the entire region, and revealed, to every watching lord, that something new was loose in the mountains. Pachacuti and his generals, his brothers, his sons, the veteran captains of the Great Siege, moved outward from Cusco in campaign after campaign. The sacred valley fell into order. The peoples of the surrounding highlands, one by one, were defeated or persuaded. The armies pressed south, to the shores of Titicaca itself, where the rich lords of the lake, the herd masters whose wealth had dwarfed old Cusco's, were broken and bound to the new power. The world of 100 quarreling valleys was ending, valley by valley, but conquest was the least of Pachacuti. The Andes had seen conquerors. What it had not seen, not since Wari, and never on this scale, was what he did with what he conquered, because Pachacuti was, above everything, an organizer, perhaps the greatest administrative mind his continent ever produced. Each new territory was not merely subdued, but absorbed, surveyed, counted, and woven into a system. Lands were divided, some for the community that worked them, some for the gods and their temples, some for the state. The old Andean custom of shared labor, the debt of work that neighbors owed one another, was lifted up and transformed into the engine of an empire. The mitta, the turn of labor, by which every household owed the state not treasure but time. Time to build roads, time to raise terraces, time to serve the armies and fill the storehouses. Taxation, in this empire, would be paid in sweat, and repaid, ostentatiously, in feasts, in cloth, in maize beer, in security. The state as a great reciprocal household, that was the idea, ancient as the Andes, now scaled to the horizon. The conquered were moved. When it served, whole communities transplanted across the mountains, loyal populations seeded into restless provinces, restless ones dispersed among the loyal. The Micmac system, empire as gardening. Local lords were kept in place but bound to Cusco, their sons brought to the capital, honored guests and hostages and students of the new order, all at once. The sacred idols of conquered peoples were carried to Cusco too, housed with honor in its temples, guests and hostages of the gods, and through it all ran the deeper claim, the one that turned administration into religion. The Sapper Inca was the child of the sun. The order he imposed was not one people's ambition, it was the light itself, spreading. Pachacuti rebuilt the worship of Inti, the sun, into a state church with the emperor at its heart. And history has met this pattern before, in Egypt and elsewhere. The ruler who reorganizes heaven in the same generation that he reorganizes the earth. The traditions remember him whole. General, lawgiver, priest, city planner, and poet. Verses attributed to him survived long enough to be written down, and they are not the verses of a simple conqueror. They are melancholy. The sun's own son, master of the four quarters, wondering at the shortness of life, a man who had turned the world over, asking quietly what any of it weighed against time. He reigned some 3 decades, and late in life did what almost no conqueror in history manages. He let go. The armies passed, in good order, to his son, a soldier the empire would come to call great in his own right. The old emperor withdrew to the valley he had made the center of the world, to his estates and his building works, and died in his bed, mourned by an empire that had not existed when he was young. His body did not leave the story. Preserved, enthroned, and attended, Pachacuti remained in Cusco, consulted, feasted, carried in procession, for as long as the empire stood. But that is a wonder for a later part of our journey. First, we must give this empire its true name, and walk out into its 4 quarters, along the finest roads on earth. Before Pachacuti went out to remake the world, he remade its center. The Cusco of his fathers, the market town of fieldstone and thatch, was not, he judged, a fit navel for the universe. So he emptied it, leveled much of it, and built it again from the ground, to a plan. And the plan, the traditions say, was a living animal. Seen from the heights, the new Cusco took the form of a great puma, the mountain lion, lord of the Andean wilds. The river, straightened and channeled in stone, ran along its spine. The grand plaza lay at its heart. And its head? We shall climb up to the head of the puma later in our journey, for it deserves a night walk all its own. The colossal terraces of Sacsayhuaman, rising on the hill above the city. Some scholars take the puma literally, tracing its outline street by street. Others hear it as metaphor, the city as the body of power. Either way, the meaning was plain to every visitor. This place was alive, and it was sovereign. Walk into it now, in the evening light, as an awed provincial lord might have walked 5.5 centuries ago. Brought to the capital for the first time, footsore from a road of weeks. The valley opens, and there it lies, stone the colour of honey and ash, roofs of deep gold thatch, smoke rising thin and blue in the mountain air. You come in along a straight paved road, across canalized water, past storehouses ranked on the hillsides in their hundreds. The streets are narrow, immaculate and quiet, laid out in ordered blocks, walled in that flawless masonry we shall wonder at properly in a later part. Dark joints tight as a closed book, walls that lean gently inward, built to converse with earthquakes and wind. The city is small, smaller than you expected. This is a capital of perhaps a few tens of thousands, not one of the sprawling anthill cities of the old coast. But its smallness is the point. Inner Cusco is a sanctuary as much as a city, the precinct of the Sapa Inca, the nobility, the priesthood, the servants of the shrines. Around the core, in a wide ring, lie the districts of the provinces. For Pachacuti decreed that the empire itself should live here in miniature, each people in its own quarter, wearing its own dress and its own headgear, arranged around the sacred center exactly as their homelands were arranged around Cusco. The city was a map of the world it ruled, at the center of the map. The great plaza, floored, the chroniclers insist, with sand carried up from the Pacific shore, hundreds of miles away, because the center of the world should stand upon the whole of it. Here the festivals turned through their calendar. Here armies were blessed and victories drunk. Here, on the great days, the preserved kings of the past were carried out to sit in state among their descendants. And everywhere, in the temples and the palaces of that inner city, gold. Gold beaten into sheets upon the walls, gold vessels, gold images, gold trees and llamas and ears of maize worked full size in the sacred gardens. We must understand this gold as the Inca did, or the whole story to come will read wrongly. Gold bought nothing. There was no money in this empire, no markets to speak of in this city. Wealth was labour, cloth, herds, and full storehouses. Gold was light made solid, the sweat of the sun they called it. Silver, the tears of the moon. To sheath a temple in gold was not a display of riches, but an act of devotion. The sun's house, shining with the sun's own substance. Remember that, when the strangers come. 2 more strands of Pachacuti's design, and we may rest our eyes. From the city's sacred core, invisible lines, siques, the Inca called them, rayed out across the whole landscape like threads from a spindle, each line strung with shrines. A spring here, a boulder there, a cave, a bend in a canal, hundreds of holy places, ordered into a single system, tended by appointed families in ceaseless rotation. The very countryside was woven into the city's devotion geography, turned into liturgy, and from that same core ran lines you could see, The roads, 4 great highways, leaving the plaza toward the 4 quarters of the earth, carrying the empire's name within them. For the Inca did not call their realm the Inca Empire. They called it Tawantinsuyu, the 4 parts together, the land of the 4 quarters, joined at this exact point of stone and gold. 4 roads, to the 4 ends of the world. In the next part of our journey, we take them, stand in the great plaza of Cusco, on the sand carried from the sea, and face north of west. The road before you is Chinchaysuyu, the greatest of the 4 quarters, running up the whole spine of the Andes, through the richest and most populous provinces of the empire, toward what is now Ecuador. Turn, and behind you lies Collasuyu, the vast southern quarter, the high plain, the sacred lake, the llama herds beyond counting, reaching down through modern Bolivia into Chile and Argentina. To one side, Antisuyu, quarter of the sunrise, dropping off the edge of the mountains into the cloud forests and the green world of the Amazon fringe, the quarter the empire could never quite hold. To the other, Kuntisuyu, down through the dry valleys to the coast and the sea, 4 quarters, joined at the plaza where you stand. Tawantinsuyu, the 4 parts together. Not the empire of the Inca. The Inca were the family at its center, a few thousand souls of royal blood. The realm itself was named for its own unity, a land defined as the joining of its directions, and the size of it defies the mind, even now. At its height, Tawantinsuyu ran some 2,500 miles along the mountains, the distance roughly from London to the deserts beyond Cairo, through terrain that would make any European empire weep. Coastal deserts, gorges a mile deep, passes higher than the summits of the Alps, cloud forest, salt flats, glacier and jungle. Within it lived perhaps 10 million people. Perhaps more. We are honest here. And the honest answer is that estimates range widely. Speaking scores of languages, heirs to every civilization we met in the deep past of our journey. How do you rule such a thing without horses, without wheels, without writing, without money? You rule it, the Inca answered, with order. Order of a completeness the world has rarely seen anywhere. The realm was counted. Households were grouped by tens, and the tens into 50s, the 50s into hundreds, on upward through thousands and 10,000s, each level with its responsible official, pyramid upon pyramid, up through the governors of provinces to the lords of the 4 quarters, who answered to the Sapa Inca alone. The census rolled through the empire in waves. The knotted cords, patience, we are nearly there, held the tallies of births and deaths, herds and harvests, soldiers owed and cloth delivered, a realm of 10 million, in which, in principle, every household was known, and the realm was fed and clothed by the great bargain we have already touched. Land divided between community, gods and state. The mitter turn of labour breathing in and out of every village. In good years the state storehouses swelled. In famine years they opened. Travellers from a Europe of beggars and starving winters would later write, with unconcealed astonishment, that in this empire no one went hungry. We may allow for the shine of hindsight. Subjects of the Inca paid for their security in obedience, in sweat, in transplanted villages and appointed marriages, and not all of them loved it. Rebellions happened. The quarters were not always quiet, but the boast held enough truth to stagger the visitors. Hunger, humanity's oldest companion, had been organized nearly out of existence, at 12,000 feet, without a single coin. The conquered were governed with the same deliberate blend of honey and iron we saw in Pachacuti's design. Submit, and your lord keeps his seat, your gods keep their honor. Housed as respected guests in Cusco, your sons are educated in the capital, and gifts descend upon you. Fine cloth, feasts, brides, favor, resist, and the armies come. And after the armies, the resettlements. Your people scattered among loyal strangers planted in your valley. Most lords, offered these alternatives by an empire that visibly kept its promises in both directions, chose the feast, and binding every valley of it together, the census and the storehouses, the armies and the gifts, the moved peoples and the travelling judges, ran the thing the Spaniards would call the finest in the world. Not the temples, not the gold, the roads. It is time to walk them. Of all the wonders of Tawantinsuyu, the one that most astonished the men who came to destroy it was not the gold. Hardened soldiers who had seen the cities of Europe wrote home, again and again, about the roads. Nothing in Christendom, one veteran swore, ran so fine. Not the roads of Spain, not the causeways of the Romans. They were describing the Qhapaq Ñan, the royal road, the great road system of the Inca. Taken all together, main trunks, branches, connectors, it ran to somewhere near 40,000 kilometers, 25,000 miles, enough road, laid end to end, to circle the entire Earth. Two great trunks carried it. One ran the length of the coast, straight as a spear through the desert, walled against the drifting sand. The other, the royal spine, ran the length of the highlands, from the far north of the empire to the far south, threading the passes, riding the flanks of the great peaks, crossing and recrossing the roof of the continent. Between the two, connector roads dropped down the gorges and climbed back, stitching coast to mountain, quarter to quarter, everything at last to Cusco. And consider, slowly, as the road itself would teach you, what that meant to build. This is country where the land refuses. The engineers of the Qhapaq Ñan met gorges a mile deep and took them, met cliff faces and cut galleries across them, met scree and swamp and glacier-fed torrents and passed them all. Where the slope grew too steep for a path, they built stairways, thousands upon thousands of stone steps, climbing the mountainside like the terraces of a giant. Where the road crossed high wet plateaus, they raised it on stone causeways above the sodden ground. Where it crossed the desert, they planted posts to mark the way when the sand blew over everything. In the steepest country, the road narrowed to a paved ribbon clinging to the rock. In the flatlands near the capital, it opened into a highway many paces wide, shaded, the chroniclers say, by planted trees, with water channeled alongside in stone, all of it built and maintained by the mitta, the turn of labour, each community keeping its own stretch the way a family keeps its own field, and all of it built without iron tools, without draft animals, without the wheel. There were no carts on the finest roads on earth. The traffic they carried moved on foot and on the soft padded feet of the llama. Caravans of hundreds of animals swaying under their small loads, herders whistling in the thin air, officials in fine cloth borne in litters, armies flowing north or south at imperial speed, and everywhere the porters, the empire on their backs. Rivers were the road's great enemy, and the answer to them was one of the most beautiful things the Andes ever made: the bridges of woven grass. Whole communities would twist mountain grass into cords, the cords into cables thick as a man's body, and hang them across the gorge from stone anchors, a floor of cable, rails of cable, the whole span swaying gently over the white water far below. To European eyes they looked like cobweb and terror. In fact, they were engineering of the first order, renewed by the local community every year or two as their mitta duty, generation after generation. Hold that image, the whole village at the gorge edge, twisting grass into a bridge, as their grandmothers and grandfathers had, because it holds the entire empire in miniature. Humble materials, communal labour, perpetual renewal, and the result a marvel. One such bridge, at Huáscar in the south of Peru, is rebuilt by hand to this day, the last living thread of the Qhapaq Ñan, 5 centuries on, and spaced along the roads, a day's walk apart, stood the tambos, the way stations, lodging, water, and storehouses, food, firewood, cloth, sandals, weapons, thousands of them, strung along the empire like knots on a cord, kept stocked by the districts around them. An army could march the length of Tawantinsuyu and never carry more than a few days' supply. The road itself would feed it. Travellers from famine-haunted Europe simply stopped when they understood this and marvelled, a state that had provisioned its entire geography in advance. One thing more must be said about these roads, and then we may rest at a tambo ourselves. You could not simply walk them. The Qhapaq Ñan was a state instrument. As much as any army, travel upon it was by right and by duty. Officials, soldiers, caravans on imperial business, communities travelling to their labour turns. The road was order made visible, the empire, drawn in stone across the impossible land. But a road, however fine, is only as fast as what moves along it. And the swiftest thing that moved on the roads of the Inca was not the llama, and not the litter of any lord. It was a boy running at altitude with a message in his memory. He is waiting for us, at a small stone post ahead, and he is the next part of our story. Somewhere on the royal road, in the grey hour before dawn, a small stone hut stands beside the highway at the crest of a pass. Inside, wrapped against the cold, 2 young men wait. They are chasqui, relay runners of the Sapa Inca, and waiting is most of their duty. Watching the road, keeping the fire, listening. Then one of them lifts his head. Far down the road, thin in the enormous silence of the mountains, comes the sound of a conch shell trumpet. A runner is coming. What happens next takes moments. The waiting chasqui is already out of the hut and running alongside the road in the direction the message must travel, matching pace as the incoming runner draws level. For a few hundred strides the two run together, shoulder to shoulder in the thin air, and the message passes between them, spoken once, spoken back, confirmed, and if there is a quipu, the knotted cord passes from hand to hand at speed. Then the exhausted runner drops away toward the hut, the fire, and rest, and the fresh runner is gone over the pass, conch at his hip, running alone through the dawn. A few miles on, the stations were set close, because these were sprints, not marathons. Another hut, another waiting runner, another exchange at full stride. And so the message flies. Not one heroic messenger crossing an empire, but the empire itself passing a word along its own body. Hand to hand, breath to breath, day and night without stopping, in relay. The speeds this achieved are almost embarrassing to the rest of the pre-modern world. The chronicler's figures vary, we are honest as always, but the consistent claim is on the order of 240 kilometers a day, 150 miles, sustained day after day, Quito to Cusco, 1,000 miles of vertical country in roughly a week. A mounted postal relay in Europe or Asia, on flat ground, with horses, would have been proud of the same numbers. The Inca did it at altitudes where lowland lungs can barely climb stairs, on human legs, legs born and raised in the thin air, trained from boyhood for exactly this. For the chasqui was no casual courier. Service in the relay was a mitta duty of the highest honor, filled by the fittest young men of the communities along each stretch of road, each serving their turn at their local station. They were fed and clothed from the state storehouses at the tambos, and they carried, along with the messages, a strange sanctity. To delay a chasqui, to interfere with him, to fail one's watch at a station, was an offense against the Sapper Inca himself, and the penalties were terrible. When a runner passed with the royal fringes business, everything on the road gave way, and what the system could carry, beyond words and cords, tells you it was built for more than administration. The chroniclers delight in reporting that the emperor in highland Cusco dined on fish from the Pacific, fresh or near enough, run up from the coast, hand to hand, over 200 miles of mountains, in 2 days. It sounds like extravagance, and of course it partly was, power showing itself the way power does, but mark what it proved every time it happened. If a fish could reach Cusco in 2 days, so could a warning, so could an order, so could the news of a rebellion, an earthquake, a strange sail on the sea, and so could the reply, and the army that followed it, marching down a road already stocked to feed it. An empire without writing, without horses, without the wheel, had built a nervous system. News moved through Tawantinsuyu, faster than it moved through any realm in Europe at that hour. The Sapper Inca, sitting at the navel of the world, felt what happened at the ends of his earth in days, and his will travelled back at the same speed, along stone roads, over grass bridges, through the lungs of running boys. But notice the strangeness at the heart of this marvel, the thing we have been circling for 2 parts now. The runners carried messages spoken and messages knotted. Nowhere in this vast, counted, administered empire, nowhere in the storehouses tallies or the census pyramids or the relay huts, was there a single written word. Every other great state in our journeys across the ancient world, Sumer, Egypt, China, Rome, climbed to empire up the ladder of writing. The Inca ruled 10 million people without it. In its place, they had the cords. Knots on strings, in their thousands upon thousands, an entire civilization's memory, held in twisted thread and color and spacing, in a code the world has still not fully broken, the quipu. It deserves a part of its own, and it is next. Take a length of cord, thick as a shoelace, and hold it horizontally. Now imagine hanging from it, side by side, dozens of thinner strings, some cotton, some fine wool of alpaca, some plain, some dyed deep red, gold, blue, green, some twisted this way, some that, and along each hanging string, tied at careful intervals, knots, small knots and long knots, single knots and clustered knots, knots high on the cord and knots low. You are holding a quipu, and in your hands, though you cannot read it, is the memory of an empire. The word simply means knot in Quechua, the language of the Inca. The device itself, as we saw among the Wari, was far older than the empire, but the Inca raised it, as they raised everything they inherited, to a scale and refinement the Andes had never seen. Across Tawantinsuyu, everything that could be counted was counted, and everything counted was knotted. The census of a province, household by household, the contents of a storehouse. So many bales of cloth, so many baskets of maize, so many pairs of sandals, herds, harvests, soldiers levied and labor turns served. The knots rode the roads in the hands of the chasqui. They piled up in the archives of Cusco. They hung, in their thousands, in the record houses of every provincial capital. And here is what makes them genuinely remarkable, not merely quaint. The number system inside them was a thing of real mathematical beauty. The knots recorded values in base 10, the same decimal system you use, with the position of the knot on the string marking its place value. Units in one band, tens above them, hundreds above those, a cluster of 4 touching knots in the tens band, 40. The type of knot distinguished digits. An empty stretch of cord meant 0, an absence you could see. Sums of whole groups of strings were gathered onto a master chord. This was not a mnemonic, a string around a finger. It was a true recording system, compact, checkable, standardized across an empire, and operable in the dark, by touch. The men who kept them were called Qhapaq Ñan, keepers of the knots, and they were a profession, trained from youth, stationed at every level of the great pyramid of tens we met earlier. A senior keeper could take down a quipu he had never seen, and read back the tallies of a district. This many households, this many in the storehouse, this many owed. The Spanish, when they came, watched this done, and were unnerved by its accuracy. Their own courts, for a time, accepted testimony read from the cords, because it was so consistently right. But now we come to the mystery, the honest edge of our knowledge, where this journey has always promised to stop and tell you the truth. Numbers, position, decimal structure. That much of the quipu the modern world has recovered, painstakingly, from the hundreds of quipus that survive in museums. What we cannot yet do, despite generations of effort, despite computers set loose on the patterns, is read the rest. Because the chroniclers insist, repeatedly and in detail, that the chords held more than numbers. Histories, they say, laws, songs, the deeds of the emperors, kept by keepers whose family duty was memory itself. Whether the quipu encoded these things fully, a true writing in thread, with the colours and twists and fibres carrying meaning the way letters do, or whether the chords were the skeleton of memory, the numbers and cues around which a trained keeper wove his spoken recitation, this, scholars still debate. Some quipus show patterns that stubbornly refuse to behave like accounting. The code, if code it is, has not been broken, and the loss hiding inside that sentence is one of the quiet tragedies of human history. The knowledge lived in the keepers. The Spanish, in time, came to fear the chords, records they could not audit, memory they could not supervise, and many quipus were burned as idolatrous things, and the keepers died, in the plagues and the chaos, faster than they could train successors. Within a few generations the last full readers of the knots were gone. The strings survive, in dry coastal graves, in careful museum drawers, some 700 years old, perfectly preserved and silent. Imagine a library, intact on its shelves, in a script no living person can read. That is the quipu inheritance, the empire's voice, waiting in thread. Perhaps it will be broken yet. The work continues, and every few years a pattern gives up a little more. Until then, the quipu keeps the Inca's greatest secret, exactly as a knot keeps anything, patiently. From the memory of the empire, we turn now to its bones, to the stone. Because the walls of Tawantinsuyu have a secret of their own, and unlike the quipu, this one we can touch. There is a wall in Cusco. It stands on a narrow street that has kept its Inca name, where tourists gather every day to look at a single stone. The stone has 12 angles, 12 corners, cut into its edges, and every one of those corners locks perfectly, seamlessly, into the stones around it. No gap, no mortar, no play. You could not slide a razor blade into those joints. 5.5 centuries of earthquakes have not opened them by a hair, and the 12-angled stone is not the masterpiece. It is merely famous. Elsewhere in the old imperial masonry, there are blocks with far more angles than 12, fitted with the same impossible closeness. Walls of them, whole precincts of them, in Cusco, and along the sacred valley, and on ridgy tops we shall visit before this night is done. This is the signature of the Inca, the thing you recognize instantly, once you have seen it. Anywhere in the world you meet it again. So let us slow down, in the proper manner of this journey, and understand what we are actually looking at. First, there is no mortar. Nothing glues these walls together. Each stone is shaped, individually, patiently, to fit its particular neighbors, and only them, the way a piece fits a jigsaw puzzle, not rough-fitted and packed with rubble, as most of the world's dry stone walling is, but dressed until the mating faces answer each other completely, often in gentle curves, the joint a dark, seamless line. Every block in a fine Inca wall is a solved problem, unique, unrepeatable, exactly at home. Second, the walls are not straight, and that is the genius of them. Look along any great Inca wall and you will see it lean, the whole face inclined inward, batter upon batter, each course set slightly back from the one below. Doorways and niches narrow as they rise, that unmistakable trapezoid shape, wider at the sill than at the lintel. Corners are rounded, nothing stands proud and brittle, everything settles, braces, embraces itself. And the reason is the ground we spoke of at the beginning of our journey, the restless, shrugging earth of the Andes. This is one of the most violently seismic regions on the planet, and the Inca built for it, as no one else has built before or since. When an earthquake strikes a mortared wall, the wall is rigid, it resists, cracks, and falls. When an earthquake strikes an Inca wall, the wall moves, the stones, unglued, interlocked, leaning into one another, shift, jostle, ride the shaking, and then settle back, each block sliding home into the one socket on earth cut precisely for it. Engineers who study these walls describe them as flexible structures. The local guides say it more beautifully. The stones dance, they tell you, and when the dancing stops, they sit back down. This is not a legend. It has been tested, terribly, again and again. Great earthquakes have struck Cusco across the centuries. Colonial chronicles record them leveling the Spanish city, church towers down, arcades in rubble, and each time, when the dust cleared, the same sight. The colonial walls fallen, and beneath them, exposed like bone, the old Inca foundations, intact, level, ready to be built on again. The conqueror's city has been rebuilt repeatedly. It stands, to this day, on masonry laid by the people they conquered. Third, and here is where honest wonder is allowed, they did all this without iron. No iron chisels, no steel points. The Andes gave their masons stone hammers of harder rock, bronze for levers and small tools, sand and water for grinding, and patience on a scale we can barely imagine. Blocks were roughed out in the quarry, hauled, on rollers, on ramps, on the shoulders of the mitter levies, hundreds of men in the ropes, then shaped in place, lifted, lowered, the mating faces pecked and ground, lifted again, tested again, hundreds of fittings if need be, until the joint closed like a book and the stone was home forever. Scholars have reconstructed the methods from unfinished walls, abandoned quarries, tool marks in the stone. Experiment has shown it all works. No lost lasers, no vanished sorcery. And the truth is grander than the fantasies. Ordinary tools, extraordinary organization, and a civilization's decision that stone deserved perfection, because that is the last thing, and the deepest. Remember the pure rocas, the stones that rose as warriors. Remember the golden staff sinking into the earth. To the Inca, stone was not dead material. It was kin to the mountains, and the mountains were alive. A wall was not assembled. It was, in some sense, the masons would not have needed to explain, persuaded, stone by stone, each block brought to the place where it belonged, and seated there with honor. They made the earth's own bones into architecture, and the earthquakes into a dance. And on a hill above Cusco, at the head of the Puma, they did it at a scale that stops the breath. Sacsayhuaman is waiting. Let us climb. The climb from the plaza of Cusco takes perhaps half an hour, up through the narrow streets, past the last walls of the old city, onto the open hillside where the wind arrives unbroken from the peaks. And then you crest the rise and stop. 3 walls stand across the hilltop, one above another, each running for hundreds of meters in enormous zigzags, tooth after tooth of grey stone, like thunderbolts drawn along the earth. That is your first impression, the size of the design. Your second impression is the stones themselves, and it is the one you will not forget. The blocks in the lowest wall are not building stones. They are boulders, megaliths, shaped and fitted with all the seamless perfection we saw in the 12-angled stone, but at a scale that belongs to myth. The largest of them stand higher than 2 tall men, and the heaviest are estimated, soberly, by people who measure such things, at well over 100 tons. Some say considerably more, each one dressed, each one locked flawlessly into neighbors of its own gigantic kind. The zigzag courses stepping back as they rise, leaning into the hill, dancing ready. The Spanish who first saw it wrote that no picture could do it justice. and that it could not have been built by men, that it must be the work of demons. They meant it as a compliment, of a kind. Standing before the largest blocks, in the thin wind, 5 centuries later, you understand the failure of their imagination. It does look impossible, so let us do what this journey does, and be honest in both directions at once. It was built by men. We know a great deal about how. The quarries are known. Some lie kilometers away. Abandoned blocks still lie along the haul routes. The tired stones, tradition calls them, boulders that never finished the journey. The chroniclers, who could still ask living witnesses, describe the work. Tens of thousands of laborers in rotation, decades of the meter, great ropes of plated fiber, earthen ramps, log rollers and levers, and the patient in-place fitting we have already learned. Lift, grind, test, lift again. One chronicler records 20,000 men on the hill at a time. The organization is the true megalith. Feed, house, direct, and relieve a workforce that size, for decades, without money, without writing, at 11,500 feet. Only Tuantansuyu, of all the powers in the Americas, could have done it. And honesty in the other direction. How the very largest stones were finally moved and seated, step by step. No one can demonstrate today with certainty. Engineers propose, experiments approximate, scholars debate. The stones keep the details to themselves, as stones do. What was it all for? The Spanish called it a fortress, because in the end they fought a terrible battle here, and the zigzag walls, which forced any attacker to expose his flank at every angle, served that purpose fearfully well. But the fuller truth seems larger. This was the head of the Puma, the crown of the living city we walked in an earlier part. Behind the great walls stood towers, halls, storehouses, shrines of the finest masonry. Water ran to it in stone channels. The enclosure could hold thousands. Royal complex, temple precinct, muster ground, sanctuary, statement. And yes, if war came, citadel. Like most things Inca, it refused to be only one thing. On festival days, the city flowed up the hill to it. The plain before the walls held ceremonies to the sun, with tens of thousands assembled. Imagine the sound of that, here, where the wind is now the only voice, and a quieter thought, before we walk down. Sacsayhuaman is perhaps the plainest statement in stone of what Pachacuti's revolution meant. A generation earlier, Cusco had been a market town among quarreling valleys, and on this hill the Chanca host had appeared, and the stones had risen, so the story says, as warriors to save it. Pachacuti raised the head of the Puma on that same skyline, stone risen as power, permanently. Every lord who came up the royal roads to the navel of the world saw it from miles away and understood, before a word was spoken, exactly what had entered the world. We could stay on this hill until dawn, and the stones would not mind. But the road of our journey runs on, down through the sacred valley, north and west along the crest of the mountains, to the place where all of this, the masonry, the terraces, the mist, gathers into the image the whole world now carries of the Inca, the estate in the clouds, Machu Picchu. It is time. We began this whole journey there. Do you remember? A ridge above the clouds, in the grey light before dawn, the mist in the doorways, the city that seemed only to be sleeping. We have travelled a long way since, through deep time and legend, war and empire, roads and knots and stone. Now, at last, we come back to the ridge knowing what we are looking at. Machu Picchu stands where the Andes begin to fall toward the Amazon, north and west of Cusco, down the sacred valley and beyond it, where the river has cut a gorge of astonishing depth and the mountains rise from it in green glades. The ridge itself is a knife-edge saddle slung between two peaks. The old peak, Machu Picchu, and the young peak, Huayna Picchu, the sugarloaf horn that stands behind the ruins in every photograph you have ever seen. The river wraps the site on 3 sides, 1,000 and more meters below. The eastern slopes exhale the mists of the cloud forest, and orchids grow on the ruins. It is lower than Cusco, warmer, greener, a different world from the cold navel of the empire, though only a few days' walk along the royal road. And here is the first thing to understand, now that we know the empire. This place was not a city. It was never a capital, never a fortress guarding anything, never, despite a century of romance, a secret refuge. The best reading of the evidence, and it is good evidence, is at once humbler and more human. Machu Picchu was a royal estate, built almost certainly for Pachacuti himself, the earth-shaker, in the generation after his revolution, a palace in the country. a place where the emperor who had turned the world over could withdraw from the ceremony of Cusco, to rest, to hunt, to entertain lords and seal alliances, to worship, and to be magnificent at leisure. The great figures of Tawantinsuyu held such estates through the sacred valley, the way the monarchs of Europe held their country palaces. This one, on its impossible ridge, was the masterpiece. It was small, by design. Perhaps some 750 people lived here when the court was in residence. Royalty and guests, priests, and the permanent staff of retainers who kept the estate. Fewer in the quiet seasons. The skeletons of those buried on the slopes tell an imperial story. People from every corner of Tawantinsuyu, coast and highland and lake country, gathered in service on one ridge, the four quarters in miniature, even here. But its smallness is nothing against its perfection, because what the builders did with that ridge remains one of the supreme achievements of architecture anywhere on Earth. They did not level the site and impose a plan. They read the mountain and completed it. Some 200 structures step along the natural contours. Temples and plazas on the height, dwellings and workshops descending the eastern slope, the whole divided, like every proper Inca settlement, into upper and lower, sacred and workaday. Terraces pour down both flanks of the ridge in green cascades, buttressing the slope even as they farm it. Staircases, 100 of them and more, many cut from single living boulders, sew the levels together. A spring on the mountainside was channeled along the ridge in a stone canal, feeding a chain of 16 carved fountains that stepped down through the heart of the site, so that the sound of falling water ran through the palace day and night. It still runs. 5 centuries, and the emperor's water still finds its fountains. And underneath everything, this is the part the eye never sees, the engineering goes deeper than the beauty. The ridge is steep, the rains here are enormous, and the whole site should long ago have slid into the gorge. It has not, because more than half the construction of Machu Picchu is invisible. Deep foundations, layered gravel and stone beneath the plazas and terraces, drainage built into every wall and walkway. The mountain plumbed like a living body, so that the water that falls on it passes through without tearing anything loose. Engineers who study the site say the unseen Machu Picchu is the true wonder. The Inca, as ever. The perfection you can touch, resting on a deeper perfection you cannot. Stone that dances with earthquakes, water led singing through a palace, a mountain persuaded rather than conquered. Tomorrow, in our journey's counting, we shall walk its streets and temples properly, and watch the sun rise through a window built for exactly that moment. But the light is already changing on the ridge. Let us not hurry. The lost city has waited 500 years for us. It can wait through one more turning of the mist. Come then. The mist is lifting, the estate is waking. Let us walk it as a guest of the emperor might have walked it, in the great days, up from the royal road, through the outer gate, into the palace in the clouds. You arrive, as everyone arrived, on foot, and the architecture greets you with theatre. The main gateway is set so that as you pass through it, the sacred peak of Huayna Picchu stands framed in the trapezoid of the doorway, the mountain received like a god at the threshold. Nothing at Machu Picchu is accidental. You will notice this again and again. The whole estate is a conversation between the buildings and the peaks around them. Windows that hold particular summits, plazas aligned on distant snowfields, carved stones that repeat, in miniature, the exact silhouette of the mountains behind them. The Apus, the mountain lords we shall meet properly in a later part, are guests at every window. You pass the long terraces first, and they are working. Maize on the warm eastern flanks, royal maize for the feasts and the sacred beer, potatoes and quinoa higher up, flowers, herbs, perhaps the prized coca on the mistiest slopes. The estate feeds itself, of course. The storehouses stand in rows near the terraces, ventilated, cool, orderly. You know, now, what full storehouses meant in this civilization. Not wealth hoarded, but obligation kept. The emperor's plenty made visible. Then the fountains. You hear them before you see them. The spring water we followed in the last part, stepping down its 16 carved basins through the middle of the settlement. The first and finest fountain flows beside the emperor's own residence. And this is no accident either. The purest water, at the royal door, then descending in order of rank through the estate below. Even the water at Machu Picchu observes protocol. The emperor's compound itself is, by the standards of European palaces, almost austere. A walled garden, a private bath, sleeping chambers of the finest coursed masonry. Walls once hung, we may be sure, with textiles worth more than their weight in gold. The luxury of a Sapa Inca was never gilded furniture. It was location, perfection, and cloth, and servants. The estate's permanent household, the Yanacona, cooking, brewing, weaving, tending. So that when the court arrived, imagine the procession, up that gorge, litters and llama trains and runners going ahead. The palace was already breathing. Above the dwellings, the sacred precinct. Here stands the Temple of the Sun, a rounded tower of masonry so fine it seems poured rather than fitted, curved, a rarity in Inca work, around a living outcrop of granite that serves as its altar. In its wall are 2 windows, and they are instruments. Through one, the rising sun of the June solstice. Midwinter, in this hemisphere, the sun at his weakest and most in need of welcome, strikes cleanly onto the carved rock at dawn. Through the other, the December solstice. Twice a year, the tower catches the turning points of heaven, exactly. Nearby, up a stair of 100 steps, at the highest point of the whole estate, stands a carved pillar of living stone called the Intihuatana, the hitching post of the sun, later tradition names it. Its angles corresponding, students of the site have found, to solstice lines and sacred peaks. What rites were performed here, precisely, we do not know. The honest refrain of our journey. The Spanish never found Machu Picchu, so its shrines were never described, never catalogued, and never smashed. This pillar is one of the very few of its kind in all the old empire that survives unbroken. The extirpators hammered the others wherever they found them. This one they never found. Hold that thought, because it is the strange grace of this whole place. Machu Picchu's fame today rests on mystery, the lost city. But its mystery is simply the shape of its mercy. The empire fell, the roads emptied, the estates of dead emperors lost their purpose and their staff. Sometime in those terrible decades, quietly, without any drama history recorded, the last households walked down from the ridge and did not come back. The cloud forest, patient as everything else in the Andes, closed over the terraces. No battle, no massacre, no burning, just an emperor's country palace, too remote to loot and too beautiful to die, folding itself into the green. The farmers of the gorge below never entirely forgot it was there. But the world did, for very nearly 400 years. And when the world came back up the ridge, breathless, in another century entirely, it would find the fountains still running. That homecoming belongs near the end of our journey, and we shall keep it there. For now, the court is at leisure, the maize is tall, the water is singing through the stones, and far to the south, in golden Cusco, the empire's true heart of worship is blazing in the sun, the Coricancha, the golden enclosure. We go there next. Before we enter the golden temple, let us honor something humbler, because gold never fed anyone, and the true wealth of Tawantinsuyu was green and grew on staircases. You have seen them all along our journey, in the corner of the eye, the terraces. It is time to look at them directly, across the old empire, around Cusco, down the sacred valley, on the flanks of Machu Picchu's ridge, up impossible slopes in every quarter. The mountainsides are stepped, contour above contour, in flights of walled fields, some broad as parade grounds, some narrow as a garden path, climbing in places 1,000 vertical meters and more. Seen in the late light, they look like the fingerprints of giants pressed into the Andes. The Inca called them Andines, and the resemblance to the mountain's own name is no accident of your hearing. It is the platform, some say, that gave the Andes their modern name. The terrace looks simple, a wall and flat earth behind it. It is not simple. Behind each retaining wall, dry-fitted stone, leaning into the hill, earthquake-ready like everything else. The fill is layered, coarse rubble at the base, then gravel, then sand, then deep imported topsoil, carried up in baskets, sometimes from valley floors far below. The layers drain. That is their genius. Mountain rain that would tear an open slope to mud passes down through a terrace like water through a sieve, wall weeping gently at the seams, soil staying home. And the stone of the walls does one thing more. It drinks the fierce high-altitude sun all day and breathes the warmth out all night, wrapping the crops against frost. Each terrace flight a ladder of little climates, warmer at the walls, cooler at the lips. On the great experimental terraces at Moray, bowls of concentric rings sunk into the earth like green amphitheaters. The temperature difference from top ring to bottom can span what a plant would feel across many degrees of latitude. Whether Moray was truly, as some scholars rid it, an agricultural laboratory, a place where the empire trialed crops against climates, or a sanctuary, or both at once, we say honestly, it is debated. But the fact of the microclimates is measured and real. Water came to the terraces the way it came to everything Inca, escorted in masonry. Springs and glacial streams were gathered high, led along the contours in stone channels, dropped from flight to flight through carved chutes, portioned out by stone gates according to schedules that the community enforced as sacred custom. Some of those canals still run, and some of those schedules. Village water turns in the high Andes today descend, the ethnographers tell us, in an unbroken line from the empire and before it. And what the staircase fields grew, the empire's own crops, were a treasure the world has still not finished unpacking. Maize on the warm terraces, the prestige crop, the festival crop, mother of the sacred beer. Higher up, the true Andean genius, the potato. Born here, domesticated here thousands of years before the Inca, in hundreds upon hundreds of varieties bred to every slope and soil and frost. And quinoa, the little grain the Inca called mother, complete nourishment on a stalk that shrugs at altitude, and beside them ochre and mashua and the whole high garden. The peoples of the Andes even taught the mountain cold to work for them. Potatoes spread on the freezing ground by night, thawed and trodden by day, dried into chuño. A food that keeps not for months, but for years. Freeze-dried rations, 1,000 feet above the clouds, 5 centuries before the word existed. Which brings us to the storehouses, the kolka. Because harvest is only half of eating. The other half is the hungry season, and the Inca made war on the hungry season as methodically as they made war on anything. You have glimpsed the kolka on every road of our journey. The ranks of round and square stone silos on the breezy hillsides above towns and tambos, doors to the cold south, floors ventilated, gravel drained. Engineering, again, in the service of patience. Grain in vessels, chuño in bales, dried fish and llama meat, cloth, sandals, wool, weapons, counted in, knotted on the quipus, counted out. The greatest depots held provisions on a scale that stunned the invaders. Years of supply for whole regions, ranked storehouse beyond storehouse beyond storehouse. Drought came, the kolka opened. The earth shook, and a valley's fields slid. The kolka opened. An army marched, the kolka fed it, and the fields at home missed nothing. This, more than the walls, more than the gold, was what it meant to be ruled by Cusco, the mountains themselves terraced into a granary, and the granary never empty. The sun's children, feeding the world from staircases. Now we may go and see the sun's own house. In the heart of old Cusco, at the meeting point of the 4 quarters, where the sequay lines of shrines rayed out across the world like threads from a spindle, stood the holiest place in Tawantinsuyu. The Inca called it Coricancha, the golden enclosure, and for once in history, the name was an understatement. Come to it as a pilgrim came, barefoot, for no one, however great, entered this precinct shod, and even great lords came burdened, carrying token loads upon their backs in humility. From outside, you would see first the enclosure wall, the finest masonry in the empire, and therefore, very possibly, the finest on earth. Long courses of dark grey stone fitted with that seamless, cushioned perfection we have learned to read, curving at the western end in a great smooth arc that masons still come from around the world simply to stand before. And along the upper wall, catching the mountain sun, ran the reason for the name. A band of pure gold, a cornice of it, wrapping the temple like a ribbon of light. Inside the enclosure stood the sanctuaries, a constellation of chapels around a court, each house belonging to a power of the sky. The greatest belonged, of course, to Inti, the sun, its interior walls sheathed. The eyewitnesses are unanimous, in plates of gold. The great image of the sun, a face amid rays, worked in gold and set to catch the dawn. Beside it, the house of the moon. Mama Quilla, the sun's sister and wife, panelled in silver, her image silver, her attendants robed in silver-woven cloth. For silver, remember, was the moon's tears as gold was the sun's sweat. There were houses for the thunder, lord of storm and war. For the rainbow, which the Inca held sacred. For Venus and the clustered stars, the Pleiades, watchers over the herds and the seed. The roofs were thatch, the finest imaginable, but thatch, and there is the whole Andean world in one image, golden walls under grass roofs, heaven's substance, and the mountain's humility, together. And in the court, this is the detail that no one who heard of it ever forgot. There was a garden of gold, maize modelled in gold, stalk and leaf and ear, planted in rows as if growing, life-size llamas of gold with their herders, golden birds, golden flowers, the chroniclers, groping for the scale of it, simply list and list. Twice a year, at the great festivals, the fields of the empire were mirrored here in imperishable metal. The harvest that could never fail, offered permanently to the power that made all harvests. If you would understand the Inca, stand a moment in that garden. This was not treasure. There was no market in the empire where any of it could buy anything. It was the Andean bargain, reciprocity, the debt of gift for gift, conducted at the very top. The sun gives all life. The sun's children answer with the most lifelike splendor hands can make. Within these courts lived the temple's household, the high priesthood. The chief priest of the sun stood second, some say, only to the emperor, and was drawn from his close kin. And the mamaconas, the consecrated women, mistresses of the sanctuary's endless work, chosen as girls from across the four quarters for beauty and skill, the aklas, the chosen ones, were gathered in great houses in Cusco and the provincial capitals, and their hands produced the two most sacred substances of the empire, the finest cloth ever woven in the Americas, and the chicha, the ceremonial maize beer that every rite required. Some would serve the temples all their lives. Some were given in marriage by the emperor's own hand, the highest favour he could bestow on a loyal lord. We shall meet their weaving again in the part of our journey that belongs to cloth, but remember them here, in the golden enclosure, at the loom in the lamplight, the quiet, ceaseless human machinery of the holy. From this enclosure, on the great days, the images of the gods went out in procession to the plaza floored with ocean sand. Here the preserved kings were visited by their descendants. Here the sequay threads of 300 and more shrines across the landscape found their common centre. The Coricancha was the knot in the empire's quipu, the point where every cord of the sacred was gathered into one hand. You know already, traveller, because you know how this story ends. What became of the gold? The garden went into the melting pots of the strangers within a year of their coming. The plates were prized from the walls. We shall stand in the room where it happened, further down our road, and count the terrible arithmetic properly. And you can guess, by now, what became of the walls, because you know what Inca walls do. They stood. The conquerors raised a church of their own directly upon the enclosure, and the earthquakes came, across the centuries, and threw the church down more than once. And each time, beneath the rubble, the golden enclosure's grey stones stood level and unmoved, and the church was rebuilt upon them again. It is all still there tonight, in the heart of Cusco. The curved wall, the perfect courts, the two architectures grown into one another. The conquered, quietly, still holding up the conqueror. But we are not ready for endings. The empire around us is still blazing at noon. We have seen the sun's house. Now let us meet the sun himself, and the whole living sky of the Andes. Lie back, in imagination, on the high grass of the Altiplano at night, 12,000 feet closer to the stars than the sea, and look up. The sky of the southern Andes is not like other skies. The air is thin and dry and utterly clear, and the Milky Way does not merely cross the darkness, it fills it, a river of light from horizon to horizon, so dense and bright that it casts shadows. The peoples of the Andes called it exactly that, the river, the celestial river. And they believed it carried water through the sky as their own rivers carried the glacier melt through the world. And here is the beautiful strangeness. Where other peoples joined stars into pictures, the Andeans read the darkness too. Within the bright river of the Milky Way there are long shapes of blackness, clouds of cosmic dust, an astronomer would say, blotting the starlight behind them. To the Inca these were the dark constellations, the shapes of living things, drinking at the river of the sky. There is the llama. You can see her, once shown, as clearly as any figure of stars, her eyes two bright stars in the dust dark of her face. And beside her the baby llama, the fox, the toad, the serpent, the partridge, a whole sacred zoo of shadow wheeling over the mountains through the year. When the celestial llama sank from sight in the season of rains, she was said to have gone down to drink from the ocean itself, carrying the waters back into the sky. Herders in the high Andes point out her eyes to their children still. Over this living sky presided the powers we have been meeting all along our road. Let us gather them now, properly, in one place. First in state, if not in ultimate depth. Inti, the sun, golden father of the royal line, warmth of the maize, lord of the empire's calendar of festivals, whose house of gold we walked in the last part, and whose image every conquered valley learned to honour above, though never quite instead of, its own gods. Beside him Mamaquilla, the moon, his sister and wife, silver lady of the months, of women, of the rhythms of planting, her temples silver, a mirror of his gold, her high priestess, a mirror of his priest, for the Andean world ran always in these paired halves, sun and moon, gold and silver, upper and lower, male and female, each incomplete alone. Then Illapa, the thunder, warrior of the sky, who kept the rain in a great jug and shattered it with his sling stone when the storms broke over the Cordillera. Lightning the flash of his sling, thunder the crack of it, the rain his sister's spilled water. In a land where a season's rain was life or famine, Illapa's shrine stood everywhere, and in drought it was to him the desperate processions climbed. And behind them all, older than all, stranger than all, Viracocha, the creator, the one the deepest prayers addressed and the fewest images dared portray. He who, in the beginning, rose from the waters of Lake Titicaca. There, again, the old lake at the root of everything, and made the sun and moon and stars at Tiwanaku, and shaped the peoples of the earth from clay or stone, and sent them out under the ground to emerge, each nation from its own cave and spring and mountain, every people, in this telling, born from the body of the land itself. Then Viracocha walked away across the world, teaching as he went, an old man with a staff, and departed at last over the western sea, promising. Some traditions whisper that one day he or his messengers would return. Hold that whisper. It has work to do later in our story. Around these great powers, the sacred world thickened without end. The Inca word for a holy thing was huqa, and huqas were everywhere. A spring, a cave, an oddly shaped boulder, a mountain pass, a battlefield stone that had once risen as a warrior, an ancestor's resting place, the mummified dead themselves. The sequoia lines we traced from the Coricancha strung hundreds of them into the empire's liturgy. Every family, every village, every province kept its own. The world was not a backdrop with gods somewhere behind it. The world was crowded with presence, negotiable, generous, touchy, alive. And living well meant keeping faith with all of it. A splash of chicha poured to the earth before you drank, coca leaves offered at the pass, the first furrow cut with a prayer. Which brings us to the greatest presence of all, the one beneath everything, the one whose name you may already know, the mother herself and her lords the mountains, Pachamama and the Apus. They have been waiting for us this whole journey. Let us go to them now. Everything we have walked upon, this whole night, every terrace and road and plaza, every field the golden staff ever tested, all of it, to the peoples of the Andes, was one being, Pachamama. The word is usually rendered Earth Mother, and that is true as far as it goes, but Pacha is one of those deep words that will not sit still in translation. It means earth, and it means world, and it means time. Epoch, era, the age one lives in, all at once. Pachamama is the living whole of it, the ground and the season together, the world as a mothering presence in which everything grows and to which everything returns. She was not worshipped the way the sun was worshipped. No golden house, no imperial priesthood ranked in state. She was older than all that, and nearer. Her worship was the texture of daily life itself. Before anyone drank chicha, the first splash went to the ground, for her. At planting, at harvest, at the building of a house, at the setting out on a journey. Small gifts to the earth, coca leaves and maize, beer and words, the constant courtesy owed to the one who feeds you. August, when the fields lay open before planting, was her hungry month, when the earth was said to be awake and owed her meal. Farmers in the Andes keep these courtesies today. The poured first drink, the offerings at planting, in an unbroken line of politeness 5,000 years long. The Spanish would fell the temples of the sun within a generation. Pachamama they never found, because she was never in a building. She was underfoot, everywhere, and she remains there tonight, and rising out of her body into the realm of storm and snow, the Apus. The word means Lord, and the Apus are the mountains themselves, not spirits living on the peaks, but the peaks alive. Mighty persons of ice and stone, each with a name, a character, a household, a territory of villages and herds under its gaze, the great snow peaks of the Cusco region. Orzangate, Lord of the South, whose glaciers feed the rivers of the sacred valley. Salcante, the wild one, standing sentinel beyond Machu Picchu, were and are lords of enormous dignity, addressed in prayer by name. Lesser hills were lesser lords, down to the small local apu that watched a single valley, a whole feudal order of living geography, from the village knoll to the ice-crowned king. Think what the mountains are in this land, and the faith explains itself. The apus hold the glaciers, and the glaciers hold the water, and the water is everything. The terrace channels, the drinking springs, the pastures of the herds. The apus make the weather. Clouds gather on their shoulders, hail walks down from their heights, lightning belongs to them and to Alapa together. They watch. Everything that happens in a valley happens in sight of its mountain. Herders climbing the high pastures speak, still, of being in the apu's house and behave as guests. When the mist comes down, the same mist that opened our journey on the ridge at Machu Picchu, it is the mountain drawing its own cloak about its business, and the sensible traveller does not intrude. Now look back, with these eyes, at everything we have seen, and watch the whole journey change its meaning. The windows of Machu Picchu framing the peaks, not scenery, audiences with lords. The carved stones repeating a summit's silhouette, portraits. The estate set on its impossible ridge among the apus, an emperor placing his house in the company of kings. The capacity of Inca masons to leave a living boulder untouched in the middle of the finest masonry on earth and build the temple around it. Reverence, exact and literal, the stone was already somebody. Even the Pururocas, the battlefield stones that rose as warriors to save Cusco. Of course, stones could be warriors. Stone was the flesh of the mountains, and the mountains were alive and took sides. This is the deepest layer of the Inca world, deeper than empire, deeper than the sun himself. The layer the empire was built upon and never replaced, because it never needed replacing. The land as a community of persons in which humanity holds citizenship but not dominion. Every harvest a gift answered with gifts. The whole of life, one long, courteous conversation with a living world. Empires would fall. This one would fall terribly, and soon, in our story. This did not fall. Ask the first drops of any shared drink in the high Andes tonight where they are going, and the answer is where they have always gone, to the mother first. But there is one more circle of the living world we must enter before we leave the sacred heights. The strangest of all, to eyes like ours, and one of the most human. For in Tawantinsuyu, the community of persons did not end at death. The dead remained, honoured, housed, consulted, fed. And the greatest of the dead did not merely remain, they reigned. The mummified kings of Cusco are waiting for us, in their palaces as they always were. Let us go and pay our respects. Of all the wonders the Spanish chroniclers set down about Cusco, the gold, the walls, the roads, none unsettled them like this one, and none takes us deeper into the Inca heart. When a Sapa Inca died, he did not leave. His body was preserved. Carefully, expertly, by methods the dry cold of the Andes assisted and the embalmers perfected, though the finest details of the art were kept close and are debated still. And then, preserved, robed in the richest cloth, seated in dignity, the emperor went home, not to a tomb, to his palace, his own palace, which remained his forever. His lands remained his servants remained his household, the whole living corporation of his descendants, his panica, every child and grandchild of his line except the son who succeeded him, remained his, dedicated for all the generations to come to one duty, keeping the dead king royal. And royal he stayed, actively, socially royal. The mummies of the emperors were not hidden away. They held court. Seated in their palaces, attended by chosen retainers, they received visitors who addressed them through interpreters of a kind. Attendants who spoke for them, conveyed their answers, managed their affairs. They were served meals at the proper hours, the food burned before them so its substance could reach them. Their cups were kept filled, toasts exchanged. The living drinking to the dead, through their attendants, graciously returning the courtesy. On the great festivals they came out, carried in state on litters into the plaza floored with ocean sand, and there they were arranged in order of seniority. The whole royal line of Tawantinsuyu, from the sons of the sun onward, seated together in the square, generation beside generation, presiding over the dances and the sacrifices with the reigning emperor enthroned among his ancestors, the newest of an unbroken company. Visitors describe the dead being visited by the dead, one royal mummy borne across the city with music to call upon another. We should let this be as strange as it is, and then let it become as intelligible as it is, because it is both. Remember the world we have just walked, a world where stones are persons, mountains are lords, and the dead of every family remain members of it. For this was not only royal custom. Throughout the Andes, ordinary people kept their ancestors near, preserved, bundled with care, housed in family shrines and mountain caves, brought out at festivals, consulted, included. Death, in this world, was not an exit. It was a change of state. The ancestor became a huqa, a sacred presence, still bound into the web of kin and gift and obligation. The emperors did what everyone did, at the scale of everything. And yet, the mummified kings were not only piety, they were also power, frozen in the most literal sense, and every year the freezing cost more. Consider, as a chronicler or a hard-headed governor would eventually consider, each dead emperor kept, forever, his palace, his estates, his herds, his servants, wealth that never returned to circulation. Each new Sapa Inca inherited the title and almost nothing else. He began his reign obliged to build his own palace, endow his own future Panica, and win, by conquest or organization, the wealth to do it with. Some historians see, in this strange arrangement, one of the hidden engines of the empire's headlong expansion. Every reign had to enlarge the world, because the past had spent nothing and surrendered nothing. The dead grew richer as they multiplied. The living emperor was, in a sense, the poorest king in his own capital. And the panicas of the dead, each a wealthy, jealous corporation with its own lands and voice and candidate sympathies, wove Cusco's politics into something dense and dangerous. Hold that, too, for what is coming. When the succession finally broke, it would break along these seams. But before it breaks, one image, the one to keep. A festival evening in the great plaza, the mountain light going gold, the crowd, the music, the smoke of offerings. And there, in the place of honor, the row of them. Pachacuti, the earth shaker himself, robed and quiet, his own face preserved beneath the fringe, seated among his sons and grandsons of the same estate. The men who built everything we have walked through tonight, still present at the feast of the world they made. The Spanish saw exactly this in the last days and could not decide if it was horror or majesty. Perhaps we can do better. It was a civilization refusing, with perfect courtesy, to let its dead stop belonging. There is one more threshold in this sacred world, the hardest one, and we will cross it gently and honestly, as we promised. High on the ice of the great Apus, the empire sometimes gave to the mountains its most precious gift of all. The children of the peaks are waiting in their long stillness. Let us climb to them with respect. In the year 1995, on a volcano in southern Peru called Ampato, an anthropologist and his climbing partner found, near the summit, something the melting ice had released. It was a girl of the Inca, perhaps 14 years old, wrapped in textiles of the finest imperial weave, seated in the posture of rest. She had lain in the ice, 20,000 feet above the sea, for 5 centuries. The cold had kept her almost perfectly. The world came to call her Juanita, the Ice Maiden. And when her face was seen, it was not the face of an idea or an artifact. It was the face of a child, asleep in expensive clothes, very far from home. This part of our journey belongs to her, and to the others like her, found on the high summits of the Andes. And we will walk it as we promised to walk everything, honestly, gently, and without looking away. The rite was called Qhapaq, the royal obligation, one rendering has it. It was rare, and it was the highest and most solemn act the empire knew, reserved for the hinge moments of the world. The death or crowning of a Sapa Inca, a catastrophe of earthquake or drought or plague, the consecration of the greatest shrines. At such moments, Tawantinsuyu offered to the mountains and the gods the most precious thing it possessed. Not gold. We know by now what gold was and wasn't worth. Children. They were chosen from across the 4 quarters. Sound, beautiful, without blemish, the perfect of the empire. And their selection was, in the reckoning of their world, an elevation almost beyond imagining. The chosen did not go directly to the peaks. They went first to Cusco, sometimes across the whole breadth of the empire, feasted at the tambos, honoured at every stage. And in the capital, at the center of the world, the emperor and the high priesthood received them in ceremony. Some were symbolically wed to one another, child to child, binding distant provinces into kinship. Then, laden with gifts, they were escorted home again, and passed home, upward, in procession, with priests and family and offerings, up the flanks of the great Apus, along pilgrimage paths built to the ice itself, to platforms raised at altitudes where the air holds barely half its sea-level breath. There, dressed in the finest cloth the Aklas ever wove, surrounded by miniature figures of gold and silver and spondylus shell, given maize beer against the cold and the fear, the children were given to the mountain. Most, the evidence suggests, passing into that final altitude asleep, folded into the posture of rest in which the ice would keep them. What did their world believe it was doing? This, as nearly as the sources and the science can take us, the children did not die in the understanding of those who sent them. They crossed. They became hukas, sacred persons, honored presences. And more, they became emissaries, the empire's own beloved sent to live with the lords of ice and speak for their people at the highest court there was. The mountain received a child of the community into its household. The community, forever after, had kin upon the peak. Provinces treasured the honor. The traditions record families exalted by it, shrines maintained for generations, the children remembered by name and prayed to as protectors. Whether every parent's heart consented to what their world proclaimed, the sources are silent, and honesty means saying so. We cannot know, and we are permitted to wonder. And we will not pretend the distance away. Between us and the priests on the ice lies a moral gulf no storytelling should paper over. They gave what was not theirs to give, by lights, not ours, in a cosmos not ours. One where death was a change of address, the mountains were persons who could be visited, and the survival of everyone might turn on the goodwill of the ice that held the water. Every ancient civilization we have walked with in these journeys did things at its altars that stopped the modern breath. The Inca did this, rarely, solemnly, at the summit of their world in every sense. To understand is not to excuse. It is only to see them whole. Science, in our own time, has treated the children of the peaks with something like the reverence their own world intended. Juanita and the others found since. On Lalailako far to the south, 3 children preserved beyond any Egyptian art, the smallest still seated as if waiting, have been studied gently and told us extraordinary things. Where they were born, what they ate in their last year, the journeys they made, confirmed in their very hair, matching the old chronicles almost line for line. They are cared for now in stillness and cold, watched over by their descendant nations. The highest altitude archaeology on Earth and the most tender. 500 years of storms, and the mountains kept them. Whatever else is true, that much the Apus honored. Come down now, gently, from the ice. Below the peaks, the smoke of evening fires is rising from 10,000 villages, and it is time we entered them. Time to leave emperors and altars for a while, and live a single ordinary day in the world all of this rested on. Forget the emperor for a while. Forget the gold, the armies, the dead kings in their palaces. Come down into a village in the high valleys, any village, one of thousands, in the last good years of the empire, and live a single day in the world that carried everything else on its back. You wake before dawn, in the cold. The house is one room of fieldstone and adobe under thick thatch, windowless, and warm exactly in proportion to how many of you are sleeping in it. Family and the guinea pigs, the koi, rustling and whistling along the walls, part larder and part hearthside companions since long before the Inca. There is no furniture to speak of. There are textiles, pallets and blankets of llama wool. And along the wall the tools, the seed, the storage jars, the loom. Outside, the stars are going out over the black shoulder of the local Apu, and the frost is on the terraces. You are of an Alu, and the Alu is the true country of your heart, more than Tawantinsuyu, more even than the village. It is the great extended kin group, the families, living and dead, who descend from a common ancestor, hold their land in common, marry among their allied lines, and owe one another everything. Land in the Alu is not owned the way a knife is owned. It is redistributed, season upon season, by the community's own accounting. This rotation of fields to this household, according to its mouths and its strength. Alone, in the Andes, a family starves the first bad year. In the Alu, nobody works alone. That is the day's first truth, and you feel it by mid-morning out on the terraces. Today is a field day, and the whole Alu is in the same earth together, in long lines, singing. The men breaking ground with the chakatakla, the foot plough, a shaft, a point, a footrest. You drive it in with your body's weight, lever the sod, step, and again in rhythm. And the women opposite, turning the clods, setting the seed. Work songs keep the lines moving together. Chicha comes down the rows. The mood, travellers noted with surprise, is nearer festival than drudgery. This is Aini, the exchange of labour, day for day, kept in memory as carefully as any quipu. They dig with you today, you dig with them tomorrow, and on other days, the larger circle. Minka, the whole community out for the common works. The canal, the bridge, the terrace wall, paid in feast and obligation. And beyond that, the largest circle of all, the empire's mitta. The same principle, raised to the state. Your households turn on the royal roads, the kolka, the army. One ladder of reciprocity, from your neighbour's potato field to the walls of Sacsayhuaman. Same word underneath it all. You owe, you are owed, you belong. Midday. Food is what it has always been here, and it is better than most of the world's. Potatoes in more kinds than you have fingers, chunyo against the lean months, quinoa in the pot, maize as moat and as flatbread, and above all as chicha, beans and squash and chili, fish if the lake or the coast road is near, cuy on the feast days, llama meat dried into chasqui. A word, by the way, that would travel into other tongues as jerky. Hunger, in a normal year, is a story about other centuries. You know exactly why, because you built the why, the kolka on the hill above the village, full, counted, and yours in the bad year. Afternoon, and the second economy of the household never stops, the spinning. Every woman, walking, talking, watching the herd, spins wool on a drop spindle, ceaselessly, by reflex. The cloth of the family comes from those hours, and cloth, you know by now, is the true gold of this world. The state takes its tribute not in coin. There is no coin. But in labour and in cloth, wool from the state herds comes down to the households, woven goods go up, and everyone is clothed. Children are at their tasks, herding on the high pasture, scaring birds from the maize, learning the spindle and the plough by living beside them. There is no school for you. School, the yachewazi, the houses of teaching in Cusco, is for the sons of lords and the chosen. Your education is the Alu itself, and the songs, and the elders' memory. Evening. The household's inspector of tens may come by, the lowest rung of that pyramid of officials counting up toward Cusco, noting births, deaths, the widow's field that the Alu ploughs first by law, before any other, even the sons. The state is real, even here. It moved your cousin's family across the mountains as Micmac settlers. It will call your brother for the army levy. It watches. But it also, visibly, keeps its side of the great bargain. The full storehouse, the feast at the festivals, the peace on the roads. Most evenings, the empire is a distant weather. The Alu is the sky you actually live under. Night now. The fire banked, the koi whistling, the llamas folded in the corral, the celestial llama's eyes rising bright over the ridgeline. Down the valley, someone is playing a flute. The high, patient, five-note song of the Andes that will outlive the empire, the conquest, and every century since. You have worked, eaten, laughed, owed, and been owed. Tomorrow the lines will form again in someone else's field, perhaps yours. 10 million days like this one, laid side by side, that was Tawantinsuyu. Not the gold. This. And of everything this world made with its hands, one thing rose above all others, finer than gold, dearer than gold, the very language of honour and power from the emperor's shoulders to the mountain shrines. Tomorrow, in our journey, the cloth itself. The weavers are lighting their lamps. If you could hold, tonight, one object that contained the whole soul of Tawantinsuyu, not the 12-angled stone, not a quipu, not even the golden maze of the Coricancha, the wisest choice would be a piece of cloth. We have said it in passing, all along our road. Cloth was wealth, cloth was language, cloth was power. Now let us sit with the weavers and understand it, because no civilization in human history, perhaps, has loved textiles more or asked more of them. Begin with the fibra, for the Andes were blessed in it beyond any land in the Americas. From the cotton of the warm valleys in natural shades of cream and tawny brown. From the llama, workaday wool for sacks and blankets and cords. From the alpaca, bred in the high pastures for millennia precisely for this, fleece fine and warm and lustrous. And from the vicuña, the alpaca's wild, slender cousin, never herded, only gathered. Whole districts turning out on the mountainsides in the great royal drives to encircle the herds, shear them gently, and release them. For vicuña wool, finer than cashmere, softer than anything Europe would touch for centuries, belonged to the Sapper Inca alone. To wear it without royal gift was, the chroniclers say, a capital offence. The softest thing in the Americas reserved for the body of the sun's son. Then the colour. Andean dyers commanded a palette that still startles conservators. Reds from cochineal. The little insect of the cactus pads, crushed to a crimson so deep and fast that colonial Europe would later fight and smuggle for it, and it remains in your world today, in fabrics and in food, as natural red. Blues from indigo, yellows and greens and violets from bark and flower and mineral, blacks that have not greyed in 1,000 years. Coastal grave cloths older than the Inca by many centuries come out of the sand looking, the textile scholars say, as if woven last year. And then, the work. The loom of the Andes was the backstrap loom, one bar tied to a post or a tree, the other to a strap around the weaver's own back, the tension of the whole fabric held, hour upon hour, in the lean of her body. A weaver did not operate this loom. She inhabited it, the cloth literally answering her breathing. On such looms, and on the ground-pegged looms of the great workshops, Andean weavers achieved thread counts and structures that modern analysts describe with a kind of professional disbelief. Tapestries denser than the finest of Renaissance Europe, weaves, double cloths, gauzes, interlocked tapestries. That museum textile department's class among the most technically accomplished ever produced by human hands, anywhere, in any age. Some techniques recovered from Peruvian graves have no name in European weaving because Europe never invented them. Understand, then, what a gift of cloth meant. The finest grade, combi, tapestry woven of alpaca and vicuña, blazing with colour and pattern, was produced only for the state, by the acklers in their sanctuaries, whom we met at the Coricancha, and by master weavers, male and female, in dedicated workshops. It was not for sale. Nothing was for sale. There was nowhere to sell it. It moved as everything of highest value moved in this world. As gift, downward from the emperor. Cloth to the general after victory. Cloth to the lord who submitted wisely. Cloth on the shoulders of the chosen bride. To receive combi from the Sapper Inca's hand was ennoblement made fabric, a knighthood you could wear. And the emperor himself, the chroniclers marvelled, never wore the same garment twice. Each day's tunic of the finest kumbai in the world, worn once by the son of the sun, and burned. Wealth, in this civilization, was not what you kept. It was what you could afford to give, and to give to the gods in fire. For the cloth spoke. This is the last depth of it. Its patterns were not decoration. The geometric blocks that march across imperial tunics, the checkerboards of the army's livery, the tokapu squares dense with repeating motifs, encoded rank, office, origin, allegiance. A lord's tunic was his passport, his uniform, his biography, legible at 100 paces to everyone raised in the code. Whether the tokapu went further, whether the squares approached true writing, sign by sign, as some researchers argue, is debated, honestly and hotly, and unresolved, one more sealed archive, beside the quipu, in a civilization that recorded so much in ways we can no longer read. What is certain is this. In the Andes, a person's meaning was worn. Weaving was not a craft among crafts. It was the mother art, the one Mama Oklo herself, in the oldest story of all, carried down from the sun. Textile, text. In our own tongue, the two words are one word, from the same root, to weave. The Inca would have found nothing strange in that at all. The lamps are burning low in the weaving houses. Outside, in the dark, Cusco is beginning to stir. For the great month is coming, the sun's own month, and the whole empire is about to gather in the plaza of ocean sand for the mightiest festival of the Andean year, Inti Raymi, the Feast of the Sun. Let us take our place in the crowd. June, in the southern Andes, is midwinter. The nights are long and hard with frost. The days are short, the light low and golden, and the sun, Father Inti, lord of the maize and of the royal line, has been weakening for months, rising each morning a little further along the horizon, a little lower, a little later. To a people whose whole world hung on his warmth, the question renewed itself every year, ancient beyond memory: will he turn back? Inti Raymi, the Feast of the Sun, was the empire's answer. The greatest festival of the Andean year, held at the June solstice, the sun's lowest ebb, to honor him, to thank him, to plead with him, and to celebrate, with absolute confidence wrapped around the oldest of fears, his turning. Cusco prepared for it as a body prepares for its own heartbeat. For days beforehand, the city fasted. No fires in the sacred precincts, plain food, salt and chicha set aside, the whole capital drawing in its breath. The provincial lords had been arriving for weeks, up the 4 highways from the 4 quarters, each delegation in the dress and headgear of its nation. The empire assembling itself in person, as it did in miniature every day in the city's ring of districts. On the eve, the plaza of ocean sand was swept and dressed. The images of the gods came out from the Coricancha, and from their palaces, on their litters, came the ones we have already met and can now greet as acquaintances. The mummified emperors, robed and fringed, carried to their places of honor in the square, the whole dynasty, gathering to watch the dawn with their descendants. Before first light, the living emperor took his place, barefoot, as everyone stood barefoot on that ground, facing the northeast, where the winter sun of the Andes would rise. Around him, ranked in silence in the cold dark, the royal kin, the priesthood, the lords of the 4 quarters, and beyond them the crowd, tens of thousands, the plaza and the slopes above it black with the empire, waiting. No fires anywhere, the stars of the celestial river fading, the line of the eastern peaks turning grey, then rose. And when the first edge of the sun broke over the mountains, the Sapa Inca rose, lifted 2 golden cups of chicha, and the whole vast crowd, as one motion, went down. The chroniclers who saw the last true festivals described the sound, not a shout, but an exhalation, a low, immense murmur of greeting rolling across 10,000 people with their arms open to the light, the sound of a world saying Father. The emperor poured the left-hand cup to the earth and the channels that carried it to the Coricancha. The sun's share and Pachamama's, always first, drank from the right, and the festival began. What followed filled days. The new fire was kindled, struck from the sun himself, focused through a polished golden mirror onto dry cotton, and if the sky was clouded, drawn by friction with anxious ceremony. And from that one flame, every hearth in Cusco was relit, the year's fire, born again, distributed household by household from the altar outward. Llamas of the sacred herds were offered, and the priests read the year's fortune in the signs. The first of the white llamas, the chroniclers say, was dedicated whole to Inti. Meat and maize and chicha in rivers went out to the crowds. The state feasting the world, the great bargain performed in public, obedience up, abundance down, everyone seeing everyone see it. The mummified kings were toasted and toasted back. The dancing began. Each nation, its own dances, its own music, the plaza turning day and night in slow wheels of colour, the panpipes and flutes and drums of 40 peoples braided together. And through it moved the emperor, gift-giving, cloth, cups, honours, brides, careers made in an afternoon under the returning sun. Stand in that plaza a moment before we leave it, because you now know everything you are looking at. The sand under your feet, the ocean, carried to the navel of the world, the gold on the temple walls, the sun's own sweat, answering the sun, the dead kings on their litters, the past, refusing with perfect courtesy to be passed, the lords in their 40 costumes, the 4 quarters, worn as cloth. The turning light itself, the oldest promise in the Andes, kept one more year. Every thread of our whole journey tied for 1 week into a single knot of light and sound. Tawantinsuyu, visible, audible, at the top of its voice. Hold it there. Hold it exactly there. The plaza full, the sun turning home, the empire young and immense and certain. Because we have reached the high noon of this story. The men who will bring the night are already alive, some of them already at sea. From here, the road of our journey runs toward the ending, and it will ask of us everything the beginning asked: patience, honesty, and a steady heart. But not yet. First, the empire has 2 more emperors to crown and half a world still to win. the conqueror who reached the sea, and his son who stretched the four quarters to their farthest edge. Their roads are waiting. When Pachacuti grew old, the earth shaker, the rebuilder of the world, whom we watched take a doomed city and turn it into an empire, he did the rarest thing conquerors do. He handed over the army while he still lived and watched, from his estates, what his son would do with it. What his son did with it was double the world. Túpac Inca Yupanqui, royal, shining and honoured, the name proclaims, had been raised inside the new machine his father built, educated in the houses of teaching at Cusco, blooded on campaign under the great generals of the Chanca generation, steeped from boyhood in roads, storehouses, censuses, and war. The traditions remember Pachacuti as the mind of the empire. Túpac Yupanqui they remember as its stride. Even as crown prince, commanding his father's armies, he took the wars further from Cusco than any Inca had imagined. And as emperor in his own right, he never truly stopped. Northward first, as prince, up the great spine of Chinchaysuyu, through the tangled lordships of the northern highlands, and against the one rival that could call itself the Inca's equal, the kingdom of Qhapaq on the northern coast. We should pause on Qhapaq, for it was no valley chiefdom. Heir to the old Moshe lands, it was the greatest power of the coast. Its capital, Chan, a vast adobe metropolis of walled palace compounds, one of the largest mud brick cities ever raised on earth. Its irrigation works enormous, its goldsmiths the finest anywhere in the Americas. Two empires, mountain and shore, one continent's edge between them. The war was decided as Inca wars so often were, not by a storming, but by a strangling. The highland armies took the mountain valleys above the coast, and with them the water. The canals of Chan answered to springs and rivers born in Inca hands. Qhapaq yielded. And in the Inca way, its excellence was not destroyed but absorbed. The master goldsmiths of the coast went, honoured and watched, to Cusco, where their art became the empire's art. The lords of Qhapaq kept their seats, under the eye of governors and garrisons, and the roads ran on north. As Sapa Inca, Túpac Yupanqui turned about and marched the other way, south, through Calasuyu, past the lake, over the salt flats, down the length of what is now Bolivia and Chile. Campaign upon campaign, the roads and tambos following the armies like a wake, until the empire's southern marker stones stood, by the traditional accounts, at a river in central Chile, some 5,000 kilometres, as the condor flies, from its northern edge. He drove east, too, down off the mountains into the eyebrow of the jungle, the montaña, and there met the limit that would hold forever, the deep Amazon, where roads rot, llamas sicken, massed armies dissolve among the trees, and the empire's whole grammar of terraces and storehouses had no words. Antisuyu stayed a frontier, traded with, raided into, never held. Even the Inca learned the sentence every empire eventually reads, this far. And then there is the strangest campaign of all, the one that may not have happened, and refuses to be forgotten. Several chroniclers, gathering the traditions within living memory of the empire, tell it seriously, that Túpac Yupanqui, on the northern coast, hearing merchant tales of rich islands far out in the western sea, assembled a fleet of great balsa rafts, the ocean-going sailing rafts of the coast, real and formidable craft, and went out onto the Pacific himself with thousands of men for the better part of a year, and returned with trophies from islands the accounts name Ninacumbi and Hahuachumbi, islands of fire. The Galapagos? Some island of the coast, grown in the telling? Pure sea story, attached to the most glorious name available? Scholars have argued every side. A celebrated modern voyager built rafts to prove such journeys possible, and possible they proved. But possible is not proven, and the honest verdict is the one we always give. No one knows. What the story tells us beyond doubt is how his own world saw Túpac Inca Yupanqui as the emperor for whom even the ocean was worth attempting, the man who had walked the four quarters to their edges and looked past them. By his death, Tawantinsuyu stood almost complete, the longest empire on earth, mountain-spined, sea-flanked, jungle-margined, 40,000 kilometres of road holding it in one web centred on the plaza of ocean sand. His mummy joined the seated company of the plaza festivals. His panica joined the dense, wealthy politics of the capital, and the fringe passed to a son who would carry the borders to their farthest northern edge, and reign at the exact moment the world's luck ran out, Huayna Capac, the last emperor of the whole. His story is the hinge of everything, and it is next. He was crowned young, the traditions say. The fringe of the Qhapaq Inca settled on a boy, and the empire he inherited was already the largest thing the Americas had ever seen. Huayna Capac would spend his whole reign at its edges, stretching them further, and history would remember him, without his knowing it, as the last emperor of the whole. His name means something close to the young, magnificent one, and the chronicles paint him in his grandfather's colours: a builder, a counter, an organizer, but above all, a campaigner. The wars of his reign lay in the far north, at the top of Chinchaysuyu, in the green mountain lands that are now Ecuador, country of proud, hard-fighting peoples who contested every valley, year upon year, in the longest and bitterest campaigning the empire ever knew. The traditions do not pretend it was glorious weather all the way. Armies mauled, revolts renewed, one grim lakeside massacre remembered in the very name of the place, the Lake of Blood. But the roads followed the armies, and the tambos followed the roads, and by the end, the empire's border stones stood further north than they had ever stood. And something else happened in those long northern years, something with consequences. Huayna Capac fell in love with the north. He rebuilt the city of Quito into a second imperial seat, and lingered there, campaign after campaign, decade upon decade. A generation of the court was raised nearer to Quito than to Cusco. Sons were born to him in both worlds. Among them, to a northern mother, a boy named Atahualpa, who grew up beside his father in the camps and councils of the frontier. While in Cusco, far to the south, among the old panicas and the proper queens, grew another son, Huáscar. 2 capitals now, in everything but name. 2 courts. 2 heirs in waiting, each at home in a different half of the world. The empire had been built, we have seen all night, on the pairing of halves. Upper and lower, gold and silver, always joined at a sacred centre. It was about to discover what happens when the halves have no centre left to join at. Because now, north of everything, at the height of everything, the story arrives at the year the world broke, and we must tell it exactly as it happened, in the order it happened, for the order is the tragedy. The strangers did not conquer Tawantinsuyu first, their diseases did, far away, years before any bearded man set foot in the empire. The ships from across the eastern sea had begun touching the northern coasts of the continent, at Panama and beyond. And from those first landfalls, invisibly, moving from person to person along the very trade routes and roads that bound the native world together, came the sicknesses of the old world of Europe and Africa and Asia. Smallpox above all, and measles and the rest behind it. Diseases the peoples of the Americas had never met, against which their bodies held no defences at all. Sicknesses that in the old world killed the unlucky and in the new world killed entire villages. The pandemic ran ahead of the strangers like fire ahead of a wind. It did not need ships. It had the roads, the beautiful, efficient, empire-binding roads, and the markets, and the caravans, and the chasqui relays. Every strength of the connected world became the plague's own road system. Somewhere around the year 1527, while Huayna Capac stood at the top of his world in the north, with the border stones freshly set, the sickness came down the roads into Tawantinsuyu. The accounts describe the emperor receiving, almost together, 2 pieces of news. Word of a terrifying pestilence loose in the empire, and word, strange, dreamlike, of floating houses on the northern sea, carrying bearded strangers. He never met them. The plague reached the royal camp itself. It took the emperor's designated heir. And then, in his second capital, in the north he loved, it took Huayna Capac. Try to feel the size of that from inside the Inca world. The Qhapaq Inca was the knot in which everything was tied, son of the sun, apex of the pyramid of tens, the living centre where the 4 quarters joined. And he was gone in days, not in battle, not by any enemy the world could name, but by an invisible thing from nowhere, which in the same season was carrying off lords and governors and generals and Qhapaq Ñan, the whole trained memory and command of the state, and uncounted tens of thousands of the people. Modern estimates of the die-off across the Americas in that first pandemic century are so vast that scholars debate them in fractions of the whole population. A third, a half, more. The empire's nervous system, its administrative mind, its immunity to chaos, all of it sickened together. His body was carried south to Cusco in state, along the Great Road, through provinces in mourning and in fever, to join the seated company of his fathers. And behind the funeral procession, the succession lay exactly where the plague had dropped it, shattered, the chosen heir dead. Huáscar in Cusco with the old court and the proper claim. Atahualpa in Quito with the frontier armies and the great generals. Two halves, no centre. The strangers had not yet landed, and the empire was already bleeding from wounds it could not see. What came next, the Andes remember as the war between the brothers, and it is next for us as well. For a few years after the great funeral, the broken arrangement held, the way a cracked wall holds, quietly, until something leans on it. In Cusco, Huáscar wore the fringe. His claim was the proper one. Son of Manco Capac, by the lawful order of the capital, crowned at the navel of the world, acknowledged by the priesthoods and the old panicas, the wealthy households of the dead kings, whose dense politics we learnt to read in an earlier part of our journey. But the chronicles, even those friendly to his cause, paint an uneasy king, suspicious, quick-tempered, boxed in by the very traditions that legitimized him, and openly resentful, some traditions say, of the dead, of the panicas themselves, the mummified emperors whose estates and servants and wealth sat forever outside the living king's reach. He is said to have threatened, aloud, to bury the dead kings and take their lands. Words that, whatever he meant by them, made him enemies in every palace in Cusco among the living guardians of the honoured dead. In Quito, Atahualpa had the other half of everything. The veteran field armies of the northern wars, the loyalty of his father's greatest generals. Quisquis, Chalcuchima, Rumiñahui, names the Andes would learn to say with dread. The treasury and apparatus of the second capital and the personal aura of the camps, a commander's son raised at his father's side, at ease among soldiers. What he lacked was Cusco, the shrines, the ancestors, the sanction. Whether it began with Atahualpa's refusal to come south and kneel, or Huáscar's demand that the north be dissolved back into obedience, the traditions blame each brother according to the teller. It began. And once begun, it was unlike any war the empire had fought, because every previous war had an outside, a frontier, an enemy, a place the storehouses and roads ended. This war's battlefield was the machine itself. Both sides levied the same mitre, marched the same roads, ate from the same kolka, read the same quipus. The empire's magnificent nervous system, built to move one will outward from one centre, now carried two wills against each other, and the strength it had spent a century gathering, it spent on itself. The war ran the length of the mountains and ran for years, and it was terrible. The northern armies, hardened by decades of frontier fighting and led by the finest commanders alive, ground their way south victory by victory. The traditions and the archaeology alike remember atrocities. Peoples who chose the wrong brother punished with a thoroughness meant to be remembered. One great people of the north, the Cañari, so devastated for their loyalty to Cusco that their survivors would later greet the empire's enemies as liberators. File that away, gently. It is how empires die, not when their subjects are conquered, but when some of their subjects begin to hope for it. The end came, with the timing of tragedy, in the same season the strangers landed. Outside Cusco, in the last great battle, the northern generals broke the last royal army and took Huáscar himself alive. Atahualpa was not there. He had remained in the north, at the hot springs outside a provincial town, resting with the core of his forces, waiting for the word. Victor, at last, of the greatest war the Andes had ever seen, master of the four quarters in everything but ceremony, preparing his triumphal road south to Cusco to take the fringe beside his ancestors. The word reached him there, Cusco taken, the brother in chains, and almost in the same breath. The messenger's roads crossing, history holding its two letters in one hand, came other word from the coast below. The floating houses had returned. Bearded strangers, fewer than 200 of them, with animals never seen and weapons that spoke thunder, had landed and were marching, boldly, insolently, up into the mountains, asking, town by town, for the lord of the land. Atahualpa, the sources agree, was curious and utterly unafraid, whatever these strangers were. Men or messengers of Viracocha out of the western sea, as some whispered. Remember the old promise. There were 160 odd of them, in the heart of an empire of millions, walking of their own free will toward a victorious army of tens of thousands. He let them come. He would see them, question them, take their marvelous animals and their thunder weapons for himself, and dispose of them as convenient. It was, by every rational measure available to him, the sensible decision. The town where he waited was called Cajamarca. The name is about to become one of the heaviest words in the history of the world, and it is the next step of our journey. Before Cajamarca, let us do what history rarely paused to do, and look properly at the 160 men walking up the mountain road, because they were not an army, and they were not an accident, and understanding what they were is half of understanding everything that follows. They came from Spain, most of them from its hard, dry western province of Extremadura, and behind them lay a story 40 years long. Since the first ships had crossed the ocean sea, the Spanish had spread through the islands and coasts of the Caribbean and Middle America in loose, violent, self-organizing bands, not royal armies but companies of adventure. Private ventures, licensed by the crown, financed like business expeditions, every man a shareholder in whatever was taken, from the commander's great portion down to the crossbowman's cut. A decade earlier, one such company, under Hernán Cortés, had brought down the empire of the Aztecs in Mexico, and the news of it, the gold of it, had electrified every harbour in the Indies. Everyone now knew what might be out there. Everyone wanted the next Mexico. The man leading the column into the Andes had wanted it longer and harder than anyone. Francisco Pizarro was in his mid-50s, old by the standards of that world. The illegitimate son of a soldier, born poor, unlettered his whole life. He had come to the Indies more than 30 years before and clawed upward through every rank of its rough school: soldier, captain, encomendero, mayor of Panama, veteran of the expedition that first crossed the isthmus and saw the Pacific. Twice already he had sailed south down the unknown coast on the rumour of a golden kingdom, and twice been beaten back by hunger, mangroves, and death. The story is told, on a starving island, with the survivors clamouring to go home. Of Pizarro drawing a line in the sand with his sword. On that side, Panama and poverty. On this side, Peru and riches. Choose. 13 men crossed the line. The third voyage found the empire, touched its rich coastal towns, saw the ordered fields and the fine cloth and the sea-going rafts. And Pizarro went back across the world to Spain itself, to the court, and returned with a royal license naming him governor of a country he had yet to conquer. He brought his brothers, and he brought Extremadura's hungriest. And in the year 1532 he came down the coast for the third and final time. What did the company have against an empire? Numbers? Nothing. 168 men, more or less, when it mattered. But look closer at the kit. Steel. That above all. Swords and armour of Toledo steel, against a world whose finest edges were bronze, and whose armour was quilted cotton. In close fighting, one armoured swordsman was worth a file of the bravest men on earth. Horses, some 60 of them. Animals no one in the Andes had ever seen. Terrifying at first sight, and tactically something worse than terrifying. Speed itself, shock itself, the power to break a massed formation and run down the fleeing. A few guns and crossbows, more thunder than substance. And the invisible allies already at work for a decade. The plagues, which had killed the emperor and lit the civil war, so that the company walked into a land bleeding from wounds it had no part in making, and full, from the Cañari north, of peoples with fresh reasons to hate Cusco and Quito alike. And they had one more weapon, which we should name honestly because the story is unintelligible without it: certainty. These were men of a crusading nation 7 centuries in the making, sincerely convinced that their faith licensed everything and their courage would be underwritten by heaven. Men who had watched Mexico prove that a few hundred of the bold could take a world. Greedy, enormously, openly. The license itself was a treasure-hunting contract, and they would count gold with a bookkeeper's care amid any horror. But greed alone does not walk, uninvited and unsupported, 200 miles up into a hostile cordillera toward an army of tens of thousands. That takes belief. The conquistadors' terrible, simple belief that God, steel, and audacity would be enough. So picture the column in the high passes, in the cold. Steel morions and horse breath in the thin air, a governor in his 50s with everything staked, the empire's own royal road under their boots. For they marched, of course, on the Qhapaq Ñan, fed at the tambos by an emperor's courtesy, watched every step by his runners, climbing toward a town where a victorious lord of 10 million waited to inspect them at his leisure. Atahualpa knew almost everything about them, their numbers, their animals, their route. The chasqui relays saw to that. They knew almost nothing about him, and yet it was Pizarro, in the last camp before the town, who was preparing a plan of perfect, breathtaking criminal audacity, modelled precisely on what Cortés had done in Mexico. Do not fight the empire. Seize the knot that ties it. Tomorrow evening, in the plaza of Cajamarca, everything in our long night's journey, the roads, the fringe, the sun's own sun, the four quarters joined at one man, is about to walk into one square at dusk. The 16th of November, 1532. Remember the date the way the Andes remember it, as the hinge on which half a world turned. Cajamarca was a modest highland town, a triangular plaza of long, empty halls around it, the hot springs a few miles off where Atahualpa lay encamped with his army. Tens of thousands of veterans, the victors of the Civil War, their tents whitening the hillsides, the chroniclers say, like a fallen snow. The Spaniards had entered the empty town the day before and been billeted in the long halls around the square, a courtesy and a cage, though whose cage remained to be decided. That night, the accounts admit, few of the 168 slept. Men who had crossed a continent on certainty wept quietly at their posts, counting the campfires of the army on the hills. Pizarro's plan was set, and it was Cortés's plan, refined to a point. Invite the emperor to a meeting in the plaza and take him, alive, out of the middle of his own world. Through the next day, messages went back and forth to the springs. Atahualpa let the strangers wait, a lord's prerogative. Then came, toward evening, in majesty rather than in force, the imperial litter on the shoulders of blue-liveried lords, thousands of attendants in checkered livery sweeping the road before him, singers, dancers, the great men of the empire around the palanquin. A court in motion, glittering, unarmed or nearly so, for this was a reception, not a battle. Perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 entered the plaza with him as the light went long and gold. The square filled. The Spaniards were nowhere to be seen, hidden, mounted and armed, in the long halls around every side, watching through the doorways, ordered to silence until the signal. Into the open walked a handful of figures, a Dominican friar, Vicente de Valverde, with an interpreter, carrying a breviary or a Bible. The accounts vary in the details, as accounts of terrible moments do. What followed was the strangest conversation in the history of the Americas. The friar, through the interpreter, delivering the formal summons of his world. The requirement that the Lord of Tawantinsuyu accept the true faith and the sovereignty of a king across the sea. Atahualpa, son of the sun, master of the four quarters, days from the fringe of a reunited empire, answered as the lord of the land. He would be no man's vassal. He asked by what authority the friar spoke. The book was offered, and the emperor. Of a civilization, remember everything we have learned, that kept its holiness in cords and mountains and living stone, that had never seen writing, for whom a book was a small dead object that made no sound. Turned it over, held it to his ear, perhaps, as one tradition says, and threw it down. The friar cried out to the hidden men. The signal gun fired, and the halls opened. What happened in the next 2 hours should be called by its name, not a battle, a massacre, planned as one. The cavalry burst from the doorways into a packed, unarmed crowd. The guns and the bells and the trumpets and the war cries of the attackers turned the enclosed square into a single panic. Steel did the rest. The crowd, thousands upon thousands in a walled space, surged away from the horses with such force that a section of the plaza wall went down bodily, and through the breach the survivors fled into the fields, ridden down as they ran. Around the litter, the unarmed lords of the empire did the only thing left to them. They put their bodies between the steel and the emperor, holding the palanquin up on their shoulders as they were cut down, others stepping into the places of the fallen. The chroniclers themselves, the men doing the killing, recorded it with something like awe. At the last, the litter swayed and came down, and Pizarro himself, wounded, the accounts say, in the hand, parrying one of his own men's blades, took Atahualpa alive, exactly as planned. By dark it was over. Of the Spaniards, not one had been killed. Of the people of the empire, thousands lay in the square. The count varies, all counts of such evenings vary, and among them much of the assembled lordship of Tawantinsuyu. The army on the hills, tens of thousands strong, leaderless and stunned by the impossible, did not attack that night, nor after. The generals held the provinces, the machine still stood. But the knot at the centre of everything, the living point where the four quarters joined, sat prisoner in a stone room in Cajamarca, hostage to 160 men. Pizarro had studied the empire better than the empire had studied him. He had seen, from Mexico's example and his own cold eye, the shape of the design we have traced all night, one sacred person at the summit of a pyramid of perfect obedience. Seize the person, and the pyramid holds still, obedient, paralyzed, awaiting instructions from a center that is now in your hand. And Atahualpa, in his stone room, studied his captors with equal speed, and saw within days the single thing that moved them. Not faith, not empire, the metal, the sun's sweat, the moon's tears, which his world had never once thought of as money. He made them an offer. It is the most famous ransom in the history of the earth, and it fills our next part. The room still stands in Cajamarca. Tourists file through it today. A plain rectangular chamber of fine Inca masonry, perhaps 22 feet by 17. Tradition and the old accounts say that Atahualpa stood in it one day early in his captivity, reached up along the wall as high as his hand could stretch, and had a line drawn there, above the height of a tall man. And then he made the strangers his offer. Fill this room once with gold, to that line, and twice over with silver, and set me free. Pizarro had a notary draw it up as a contract. Of course he did. We know these men now. A formal document in the law of Castile, the ransom of an emperor, notarized. And then the empire did the thing that, of everything in this long night, may be the most quietly astonishing. It obeyed. From his stone room, the captive knot of the world gave his orders, and the machine we have spent hours learning. The roads, the relays, the storehouses, the pyramid of tens, turned itself to the task. Out along the Qhapaq Ñan went the chasquis with the emperor's word, and back down every royal road, month after month, came the light of the world on porters' backs and llama trains, the golden sun images of the provincial temples, the plates stripped, on the emperor's own instruction, from the walls of the Coricancha itself, his ancestors' holiest house, unroofed of its light to buy the son of the sun. Vessels, crowns, the golden maze of the eternal garden, the llamas of gold with their golden herders. Everything we stood before, in wonder, in the golden enclosure, coming down the mountain roads in sacks. Try to see one of those caravans on the high road at evening, because both worlds are in it, passing each other without touching. To the bearers, the loads were the holiest substance there was, the sun's own sweat, sent by his captive son, the most sacred objects of the four quarters travelling under guard. An empire ransoming its living centre, exactly as its whole logic of reciprocity and sacred kingship demanded. To the men waiting in Cajamarca, tally books open, the same loads were bullion, weight, fineness, shares. Two value systems, one caravan. The whole conquest is in that image. Through the months of the gathering, the strange half-life of Cajamarca went on. Atahualpa in captivity remained, in every functional sense, Sapper Inca. His court came to him, his women served him, his generals held the country on his word. And his enemies died on his word too, for from the stone room he ordered the war's last account settled. His brother Huáscar, captive of the northern generals since the fall of Cusco, was killed on the road. Before, Atahualpa is said to have calculated, the strangers could think to use him as a rival piece on the board. The Spaniards, meanwhile, taught their prisoner chess, marvelled at his intelligence. The accounts are unanimous about the intelligence, and watched the room fill. By the summer of 1533 it was done, or done enough. The melting had already begun. For weeks the forges of Cajamarca burned day and night, and into them, weighed, noted, notarized, went the garden of the sun, the golden maze, stalk by stalk, the llamas and their herders, the faces of the gods. The 1,000 years of the finest goldsmithing in the Americas, Chimors absorbed genius and all, rendered down to ingots for the convenience of division. A fifth to the king across the sea, shares to the horseman, shares to the foot, the arithmetic exact. the historians still wince at the inventory, one of the greatest destructions of art in the history of the world, conducted by bookkeeping. 11 tons of gold objects, by the common reckoning, and twice the silver. The room had been filled as promised. The contract had been performed, and so we come to it. The part of the story that even the conqueror's own chroniclers tell with unease. They did not free him. With the ransom melted and shared, Atahualpa's captivity simply continued and curdled. Rumors, convenient rumors, of great native armies marching to a rescue, factions among the Spaniards, newly arrived men with no share in the gold, hungry for the next stage. The cold calculus that a freed Atahualpa was the most dangerous man in the hemisphere, and a held one now merely a risk. There was a proceeding, call it a trial if the word will bear it. Many of the Spaniards present would not. Charges assembled of usurpation, of Huáscar's death, of idolatry, of plotting. The sentence was death by burning. At the stake, the Friar Valverde offered a bargain of his own: accept baptism, and the fire would be commuted to the garrote, Atahualpa, for whom burning meant not only agony but annihilation, the destruction of the body his world required for the life beyond, for the seated company of the ancestors, accepted the water and the Christian name, and was strangled instead. It was the 26th of July, 1533, 8 months and 10 days after the evening in the square. Even at the time, even among the victors, men called it murder. The king in Spain rebuked it. History has not softened the verdict. The knot at the centre of the world was gone. Payment taken, promise broken, the son of the sun dead by contract and garrote. And Pizarro's company, 160 men and their reinforcements, now held the centre of an empire of millions, with the only tool remaining, a new emperor of their choosing on a string. The age of the puppet kings was beginning, and with it, the empire's long, defiant refusal to die. The conquerors marched on Cusco within weeks of the garrote, and the road itself tells you how strange this conquest was. They marched it as allies. Huáscar's shattered faction, the Cañari and other peoples scourged in the civil war, whole provinces with scores to settle against Atahualpa's northern generals. They greeted the strangers, fed them, fought beside them. Battle by battle down the spine of the empire, it was native armies, tens of thousands strong, who did much of the fighting on both sides, with the steel and horses of a few hundred Spaniards as the terrible tipping weight. The Andes were not conquered by 160 men. They were conquered by the civil war, continued, with a new faction that no one yet understood was playing an entirely different game. In Cusco, which the Spaniards entered in November 1533, 1 year almost to the day after Cajamarca, Pizarro crowned his solution to the problem of ruling 10 million people, a Sapa Inca of his own. The choice fell on a young prince of the Huáscar line, Manco Inca. Legitimate, presentable, and grateful, for the strangers had destroyed his family's destroyers. The old machine, desperate for its centre, accepted him. The fringe was bestowed. The festivals resumed. The pyramid of tens began, cautiously, to turn again, reporting now, though the provinces could not see it, to a committee of encomenderos. For a year or two the fiction held. The Spaniards' avarice was bottomless but at least comprehensible. The empire had absorbed conquerors' demands before. Then the fiction ate itself. In occupied Cusco, the young emperor was humiliated by degrees history has recorded and we need not linger in. His palaces plundered, his household abused, his person, at the worst, chained. Manco Inca endured, watched, learned exactly what his crown was worth to its givers. And then, in the autumn of 1535, he played the puppet one last, perfect time. He asked leave to go perform ceremonies in the valley, promising to bring back a golden statue he knew the Spaniards coveted. They let him go for the gold. He went, and razed the 4 quarters. What rose in the following months was the largest war the Andes ever saw, the Great Rebellion. In 1536, Manco's armies closed on Cusco. The chronicler's counts run from 50,000 to fantastic figures beyond it, and even the sober modern readings say, one of the greatest hosts ever assembled in the Americas, against a garrison of under 200 Spaniards and their native allies. The siege that followed lasted the better part of a year, and its hinge was the place our journey already knows, Sacsayhuaman, the head of the Puma, whose zigzag megaliths became a fortress in earnest at last. The rebels took it and rained fire on the city below. Cusco burned for days, the thatch of the imperial capital going up in one conflagration. Until, in the desperate counterstroke, the whole war turned on. The besieged cavalry fought its way up the hill and stormed the great terraces in days of close fighting that both sides' descendants would remember in epic terms. There died, among many, a rebel captain the Spanish accounts themselves honor, a lord who held the last tower alone, wielding captured steel, and leapt from the wall rather than surrender. The Spaniards held the hill and held the city, barely. A relief column from the coast was annihilated in the passes. For a season, the conquest hung by threads. It did not break, and the reasons are the whole story in miniature. Horses and steel on open ground, always. Native allies in the tens of thousands. For the peoples the empire had punished did not come back to it in its extremity. The siege army's own logistics, Mitta farmers must plant or worlds starve, and a year is longer than any levy can stand in the field. And the plagues, and the plagues, and the plagues. Manco raised the greatest army of his world, and it was not enough. And being the man he had become rather than the boy they had crowned, he did not die on a gesture. He gathered the court, the loyal remnant, the sacred images, everything portable of the empire's heart, and withdrew, fighting, down off the roof of the world. Northwest, beyond Machu Picchu's district, down into the eyebrow of the jungle where roads rot and horses founder, and the empire's oldest frontier now became its shield. There, at Vilcabamba, he built a capital in exile, and Tawantinsuyu, which the world believes died at Cajamarca, in fact lived on. A rump state in the cloud forest, raiding the highways, harbouring the old rights, crowned and defiant for one more generation. 36 years, 4 more emperors, the last free Incas. Their hidden kingdom is the next to last chapter of the fall, and our road now follows theirs, down into the green. Follow the fugitive court down from the cold. Below the last terraces the road becomes a trail, the trail a green tunnel, the air thickens and warms, the mist of the cloud forest. The same mist that opened our night on the ridge at Machu Picchu closes behind the column like a door. Horses founder here, and steel rusts, and armoured men move at the pace of their misery. It was the one country in the 4 quarters where everything the conquerors were counted for nothing. Manco Inca had chosen his refuge with a general's eye. Vilcabamba, the name covers both the region and the capital he raised in it, became, for 36 years, the empire in miniature and in exile. A city grew in the forest. Plazas, halls, shrines for the rescued images of the gods, roofs. The archaeologists would one day note with a kind of ache of Spanish-style tile made by craftsmen who had seen Cusco occupied. The court kept the calendar and the festivals. The aclas wove. The Qhapaq knotted their records. The fringe passed, reign by reign, in the old form. And this was no hermit kingdom hiding its head. Manco's warriors, armed increasingly with captured swords, riding captured horses, drilled by the renegades, and prisoners the little state accumulated, struck up out of the green onto the royal roads, ambushed convoys, burned way stations, made the whole province between Cusco and the coast a country of fear. The last Incas ran, in effect, a guerrilla war from a jungle capital. 4 centuries before the world coined the term. They were helped, bitterly, by their enemies. For the conquerors, with the empire's gold divided, had fallen upon one another. Pizarrists against Almagrists, partner against partner, in civil wars as murderous as anything they had inflicted. Almagro executed by the Pizarros, Francisco Pizarro himself cut down in his own palace in Lima by Almagrist swordsmen, rebellion against the crown itself, royal viceroys killed in battle. For 2 decades the colony devoured its founders, and refugees from every losing faction fled to Vilcabamba, where Manco sheltered them for their swords and their news. It was a party of such guests. Almagrist fugitives, men who owed him their lives, who, in 1544, calculating a pardon from Spain for the deed, murdered Manco Inca at a game in his own courtyard. His guards killed them all before they reached the forest. It changed nothing, and it changed everything. The empire's great war leader was gone at perhaps 30 years old, and the fringe passed to children. And now the story turns strange and human and sad, in the way long endings are. The next reigns were a duel not of armies but of embassies. Spain, its own house bloodily reordered, wanted the last Inca out of the jungle by treaty, not conquest. The jungle court wanted survival and haggled for it with skill. One young emperor, Sari Túpac, took the bargain, came out, in state, to Cusco and a Spanish pension, estates in the Sacred Valley, a baptism, and a quiet death a few years later that rumour, of course, called poison. His brother Titu Cuze, subtler and stronger, ruled Vilcabamba for a decade of masterly ambiguity, negotiating always, converting nominally, admitting missionaries and containing them, signing treaties and keeping his powder dry. And, in the act for which history owes him most, dictating to a friar his own account of everything, the conquest as the Incas lived it, his father's story, the massacre and the treacheries set down in Spanish under his name. The empire, at last, speaking in the record in its own voice. It survives. Students read it today. Then, in 1571, Titu Cuze died suddenly, fever, the age's ordinary assassin, and everything hardened at once. In Vilcabamba, the priests and captains of the old faith raised his younger brother, Túpac Amaru, the royal serpent, a prince of the temples, unbending as his brother had been supple. In Cusco, a new viceroy had arrived, Francisco de Toledo, the great, cold organizer of Spanish Peru, a man determined to end, once and for all, the scandal of a free Inca in the mountains. Envoys were sent up the green trails under flags of parley. On the frontier, in the confusion of those months, envoys died. Toledo had his cause. In the spring of 1572, the last army of the conquest, Spanish companies and thousands of native auxiliaries went down into the forbidden country the way armies go when they are finally serious. The little state fought at the passes and bridges and broke. In June, the soldiers walked into Vilcabamba itself and found it burning. Fired by its own people, the images and the sacred things carried off ahead into the deeper forest. The last capital of Tawantinsuyu was ash and empty rain. The emperor was gone into the green with a handful of companions, making for the deep Amazon, beyond the last edge of every map his ancestors had ever drawn. For weeks the pursuit followed rumours downriver, and in the end, betrayed by the campfire's light, the accounts say, deep in the forest night, the last Sapa Inca was taken alive. What was done with him belongs to the next part of our journey, the ending of the ending. Let us walk it slowly and with respect. He has earned that from every century since. They brought him up out of the forest in chains, back along the roads his ancestors had built, up from the green, through the cloud line, into the cold, clear air of the highlands, to Cusco. The city his family had raised, the navel of the world, now the seat of his judges. The Viceroy Toledo meant the ending to be public, legal, and final, and it was all three. There was a trial. Brief, its verdict never in doubt. On charges the prisoner could barely have understood in the form they were framed. The sentence was death. Voices rose against it, and it matters to the record that so many of them were Spanish. Churchmen, jurists, old conquistadors' sons, pleading that this was no rebel taken in arms, but an anointed king who had ruled his own land, that Spain itself would bear the shame of it. Toledo did not bend. He understood, with his cold clarity, exactly what he was ending, and that was the point of ending it. On the appointed day, a September day in 1572, Túpac Amaru was led on a mule through streets that could not hold the crowds. The accounts, Spanish and native alike, agree on the scale of it. Tens of thousands of Andean people filling the plazas and the terraced hillsides of the city, and out of them a sound the chroniclers struggled to describe. A single continuous wail of grief rising from a world watching its last king pass. In the great square, the same square of our whole night's journey, the plaza of ocean sand, where the mummified emperors had sat in their festival rows, where Inti Raymi had greeted the returning sun, a scaffold stood. What is remembered best is how quiet he was. On the platform, the young emperor raised his hand, and the vast crowd's lamentation, the accounts say, fell silent at the gesture, all at once, tens of thousands of people, still, because their king had asked it. He spoke briefly. The friars at his side had won his conversion in his final days. How deeply, no one can ever know. And some of his last recorded words move between worlds in a way that has haunted every historian who has read them. Then the executioner, a Cañari, the sources note, the old wounds of the Civil War attending even here, did his work with a single stroke. The head was set on a pike in the square, as the sentence required, to teach finality. It taught the opposite. By night, the plaza began to fill, silently, endlessly, with Andean people coming to venerate it. The Spaniards, unnerved, took it down within days and buried it. And out of that burial grew the whisper that would not die for 400 years, the legend of Inca, that the king's buried head was not dead but alive, and growing, slowly, a new body under the earth, and that when the body was whole, the Inca would rise, and the world would turn right way up again. Peasants in the high Andes were telling that story to folklorists, in complete earnest, well within living memory. The dynasty of Manco Capac, the line of the golden staff, the children of the sun, some 13 reigns from legend to scaffold, was ended. 200 years later, when the greatest native uprising in the history of the Americas rose against colonial Peru, its leader, a muleteer landowner of royal descent, would take, as his name of war, Túpac Amaru II. The name alone raised the southern Andes. That is what Toledo's finality purchased. But our journey does not end on a scaffold, traveller, because the empire's truest story does not. The kings could be killed. What they had built and what their people were proved very much harder to kill. And the last hours of our night belong to that survival, to the stones, to the lost city coming home, and to the living Andes. Let us turn, gently, toward the light. Empires end twice, once in the world and once in memory. The first ending we have watched. The second never quite happened, and the reasons why are the quiet marvel of the centuries that followed. The colonial age settled over the Andes with enormous weight. The encomiendas and then the haciendas took the valleys. The mita, the old turn of labour, the empire's generous engine, was seized and turned into something monstrous. The meter of the silver mines, above all at Potosi, the mountain of silver in the south whose veins financed Spain's wars for 2 centuries and consumed Andean lives on a scale that colonial officials themselves recorded with unease. The extirpators of idolatry went shrine to shrine with hammers. The great hukas were smashed or built over. The mummified emperors themselves were hunted down in their hiding places. The Spaniards feared them precisely as political beings, rallying points, exactly what they had always been. And the seated company of the plaza was scattered, hidden, or destroyed. Populations, still bleeding from the pandemics, were gathered forcibly into new planned towns to be counted, taxed, and churched. And yet, walk those same centuries close to the ground, and everything we learned in our long night is still there, bent, renamed, and alive. The stones first, because they are the plainest teachers. The conquerors built their Cusco directly on the Inca courses, church on temple, mansion on palace. And the earthquakes came, 1650, 1700s, 1950, and each time delivered the same silent lecture. The colonial upper stories in rubble, the old walls beneath standing level and unmoved, and the city rebuilt, again, on Inca foundations. The dancing stones simply outlasted every argument made against the people who set them. The living patterns held like the walls. The Elu, the deep kin community, older than the empire itself, survived reduction and relocation and every colonial ordinance, and holds land in the high Andes to this day. Aini and Minca, the exchanges of labour, went on under the haciendas' noses and go on now. A roof raised, a canal cleaned, feast for work, day for day. The terraces stayed in cultivation where the people stayed. The water turns kept their ancient schedules. Pachamama, who had never lived in a building, received her poured first drink of chicha under Christian centuries without interruption, and the church, wisely or warily, made room. The Virgin's mantle spread over the Earth Mother. The mountain apis greeted alongside the saints. The old festivals folded into Corpus Christi week, where, in Cusco, the saints' processions to this day follow the paths and the season of the festivals of the sun. Scholars call it syncretism. The Andes might call it what it had always done with conquerors' gods, housed them, honoured them, and continued. Even the voice survived, and this is perhaps the strangest mercy of the story. The church, needing to preach, standardized, and spread Quechua, the empire's tongue, printing grammars and sermons in it, carrying it in some regions further than the Incas themselves had. The language of the four quarters rode its conquerors' missions into the future, and in that future the empire kept speaking in other ways, in the chronicles of mixed-blood sons like Garcilaso de la Vega, child of a conquistador and an Inca princess, whose great book of the Incas, written in exile in Spain, gave Europe its enduring image of the just empire of the sun. In a native lord's 1,200-page illustrated letter to the king, drawing the whole broken world in pen and ink, mailed into the void and found, 3 centuries later, in a Copenhagen library, in the whispered legend of the growing king beneath the earth. And when the colonial world itself finally shook, in 1780, in the great rising that took the name Túpac Amaru II and set the southern Andes aflame, the fear it lit in the rulers tells you what the memory was still worth. In the repression afterward, the authorities banned Quechua literature, banned the royal dress and the portraits of the Incas, banned the very symbols of the old world. You do not ban what is dead. 2.5 centuries, then, after the scaffold in the plaza, the language spoken, the terraces green, the mother fed her first drops, the stones level under everything, and the empire's name so alive that men legislated against its picture. The world beyond the mountains, meanwhile, had mostly forgotten, filed the Incas away with the lost things, a golden rumour behind the silver mines. It would take a new century, and a young man with a mule train and a camera to remind it. He is climbing a ridge in the cloud forest in the July of 1911. Let us climb with him, one last time, toward the mist. July 1911. A young American academic, Hiram Bingham, a lecturer from Yale, long-limbed, restless, hungry for a discovery to hang a life on, is leading a small expedition down the gorge of the Vilcabamba River below the Sacred Valley on a new mule trail lately blasted along the canyon wall. He is looking, as it happens, for the wrong thing. For Vilcabamba, the last capital, the refuge in the jungle, the prize every historically minded traveller in Peru dreamed of. He has been asking, farm by farm, whether anyone knows of ruins. And at a bend of the river, camped by a roaring rapid, he meets a farmer named Melchor Arteaga, who says, for a small consideration, that yes, there are ruins, good ones, up on the ridge above. He names the mountain, the old peak, in Quechua, Machu Picchu. The next morning is cold and drizzling. The climb is brutal, down to a log bridge over the rapids, then up, hand over hand in places, through cloud forest, snakes on the trail, 2,000 feet of it. Near the top they come to a hut and a marvel before the marvel. 2 farming families live up here, off the world's every map, growing maize and potatoes. On Inca terraces they have cleared themselves. It is a small boy from these families, barefoot, who is sent to guide the tall stranger the last stretch of the way. And then the boy leads him along the ridge, around a promontory, and the forest opens. Bingham's own account keeps the stunned flatness of true astonishment, walls of white granite ashlar, mantled in trees and moss and hanging orchids, terraces in flight after flight, a curved royal tower of masonry as fine as anything in Cusco, temples with their great stones still seated true, a whole city dreaming under the green, exactly as the clouds had kept it. He wrote later that it seemed an unbelievable dream, and that he barely trusted his own notes. He took a photograph, the first ever made of Machu Picchu, of the small boy standing by the perfect walls. Then, being the man he was, he wrote in a field book, measured what he could, and climbed back down by dark. You know, traveller, what he had found, because we have walked it together in this very night. Pachacuti's estate in the clouds, never lost to the families farming its terraces, never found by the Spaniards, never entered in their records, and therefore never smashed, the one great untouched jewel of the empire, held in trust by remoteness and mist for very nearly 400 years. Bingham never fully understood it. To his death, he argued it was Vilcabamba itself, the lost capital. An identification scholarship would gently dismantle decades later the true Vilcabamba. In bitter irony, he also visited, deeper in the jungle, and passed over as too poor to be important. But what he understood perfectly was what it would mean. He came back with expeditions, cameras, and the backing of a young magazine called National Geographic, which in 1913 gave its entire issue to the city in the clouds. The photographs went around the world in a way, perhaps no ruins ever had. The Incas, filed away for centuries as a golden rumor, returned, overnight, to the world's imagination, wearing the image they wear still. The terraces, the tower, the Sugarloaf Peak, the mist. The rest of the century did its work in both directions. Scholarship slowly restored the truth of the place. The royal estate, the water temple craft, the invisible engineering, and archaeology spread from it across the whole Inca world, reading the roads and the storehouses and the quipus with ever more humility. Tourism grew from a mule trail to a railway to a torrent. Today the site must ration its own admirers by the hour, and Peru labours, as all keepers of wonders do, to love the city without loving it to death. The crates of artifacts Bingham shipped to Yale became a century-long grievance and, at last, a homecoming, returned to Cusco by agreement in our own era. Even the small boy in the first photograph has been given back his name by researchers, and in 1983 the world made it official, inscribing the sanctuary among the heritage of all humankind. A later popular vote would call it one of the new Seven Wonders. The empire that lost everything, holding, 5 centuries on, one of the 7 best-loved places on earth. But the finding, in truth, runs deeper than any of that. And here is the thought to carry into our last miles tonight. Machu Picchu was never lost to the Andes, only to the world that had done the breaking. What happened on that drizzling July morning was not a discovery. It was the world being led back, by a Quechua farmer's directions and a Quechua child's bare feet, to see what had been kept, like so much else. For the deepest secret of this whole story is not on any ridge. It is in the valleys all around it, cooking supper as the lights come on, and it is the last place our journey goes. Every story of a fallen empire tempts us toward one lazy sentence, and then they were gone. Tonight, at the end of our long road, we get to say the opposite, and to mean it literally. They are not gone. Millions of people speak Quechua tonight. The Runazami, the people's speech, the tongue of the 4 quarters, across Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, and beyond. One of the most widely spoken indigenous language families of the Americas, an official language of nations, taught, broadcast, sung, and argued in. Millions more speak Aymara, the old tongue of the Lake Country. Children are being put to bed in these languages right now, somewhere under the celestial Lama's eyes, perhaps being told, in Quechua, a story about the Incas. And the world of our journey is not a museum to them, it is Tuesday. In the high valleys, the Alu still holds and works its land. Aini still swaps labour day for day. Minka still raises the roof and cleans the canal, feast and all. The terraces, many of the very flights the empire walled, still carry potatoes in more varieties than any supermarket on earth has names for, and quinoa, the mother grain, now sown on 5 continents. Chuño is still freeze-dried on the frost of June nights. The water still moves by the old turns and the old courtesies. Pachamama still receives the first splash of every shared drink, and August is still her hungry month, and the offerings still go into the ground. Now, often, with a saint's blessing folded in that old Andean way of housing new gods without evicting the family. The uppers still preside. Ozangate and Salcante are still lords, greeted by name. Pilgrims still climb to the ice. Tens of thousands of them, at the great snow star pilgrimage of Koilariti each year, dancing at Glacier's edge in a festival that is Christian by its banners and immeasurably older in its bones. In Cusco each June, Inti Raymi returns, the Feast of the Sun, reconstructed in the last century from the chronicles and beloved since. The plaza and Sacsayhuaman man filling once more with the Sapa Incas procession, in ceremony now, in continuity all the same, the city's great pageant on the old solstice, before the old walls. The chasqui's roads are still under everyone's feet. Hikers walk the Qhapaq Ñan's mountain stretches. Whole sections serve villages as they always did. The road system itself now stands, like Machu Picchu, inscribed among the heritage of humankind, 6 countries sharing its keeping. And at Huáscar, where we stood in wonder in the middle of our night. Every June, still, 4 communities gather at the gorge, and the grass is twisted into cords, and the cords into cables, and the old bridge is cut loose to fall away downstream while the new one, woven by hand, by everyone, as a festival and a duty, takes its place across the canyon. 500 years and more, unbroken. It may be the most beautiful single fact in the Andes. An empire's engineering, surviving not as a ruin, but as a village's annual act of togetherness. The weavers still weave. Backstrap looms against the doorposts, the old motifs running through the cloth. Cooperatives in the highland towns, now carrying patterns a museum could date to the empire, and a grandmother can read at a glance. The panpipes and the quena still carry that high, patient, 5-note song down the valleys and, these many decades, around the whole world. And the old food of the terraces, the 1,000 potatoes, the grain of the mother, now feeds continents that have never heard the word elu. When you meet a potato anywhere on this earth tonight, you are meeting the Andes. None of this, we should say plainly, is a postcard. The centuries since the conquest have been long and often bitter for the peoples of the Andes. Poverty, exclusion, contempt for the language and the braid and the countryside, struggles that reach into living memory and into this morning's news. Quechua speakers have fought for schools, for respect, for the right of their tongue to be heard in courts and parliaments. And a winning ground, anthems sung in it, films and pop songs made in it, professors and ministers raised in it. The pride is not nostalgic, it is current, and it is fierce. So let the last fact of our journey be the largest one. The Spaniards took the gold, the kings, and the state. They could not take the people, the language, the mother, the mountains, or the way neighbours owe one another a day's work. Tawantinsuyu, as a government, lasted barely a century. As a way of being human in a vertical world, it is 5,000 years old and having supper right now. The empire fell. The Andes did not. And now, traveller, the fires are banked, the celestial llama is high, and our long road has one last gentle mile, back up through the mist, to the ridge where we began, to take our leave the way long journeys deserve. Before the mist takes us back, let us stand still one moment on the high road and look out over everything we have crossed tonight, the way a traveller pauses at the last pass and sees the whole country of the journey laid out behind, small and clear and complete. We began in deep time, Carol raising the first city of the Americas while Egypt's pyramids were new. Chavin's God in its dark labyrinth, the Nazca writing on the desert for the sky, the Moshe's living faces in clay, Tiwanaku's fields of warm water on the roof of the world, Wari's roads and storehouses and knotted cords. 4,000 years of the Andes learning, layer upon layer, how to be the Andes. Then the golden staff, sinking into the earth of one small valley. The little kingdom no caravaner would have wagered on. The terrible year the Chanca came, and the stones rose, and a passed-over prince took the name Earthshaker and remade the world. We watched the 4 quarters join at a plaza floored with ocean sand, walked the 40,000 kilometers of the Qhapaq Ñan, ran with the chasqui, puzzled at the quipu's sealed archive, laid our hands on walls that dance with earthquakes, climbed to the estate in the clouds, and heard an emperor's fountains still running. We met the living sky and the living mountains, the mother underfoot, the kings who reigned beyond death, the children of the high peaks in their long stillness, spent a day in the Elu and an evening at the loom, stood in the plaza at dawn as 10,000 people greeted the returning sun. And then the darkening road, the plague that outran the strangers, the brothers' war, the evening at Cajamarca, the room filled with the sun's sweat, the puppet king who raised the 4 quarters, the last free kingdom in the green, the quiet man on the scaffold. And after him, against every expectation of the conquerors, the stones standing, the language spreading, the bridge rewoven every June, the lost city led back into the light by a barefoot child and the people, never lost at all, having supper in Quechua tonight. What does it all come to? Perhaps to this. The Inca are humanity's great proof of how much can be done with how little, and how differently done. An empire without writing that never forgot a debt or a household, without money that abolished hunger in one of the hardest lands on earth, without the wheel that built the finest roads of its hemisphere, without iron that raised walls no earthquake in 5 centuries has thrown down, every other great state in our nights together, Sumer, Egypt, Rome, China, climbed by the same ladder, writing, coinage, the wheel, iron. The Inca climbed by another ladder entirely. Reciprocity, storage, labour owed and honoured, stone persuaded rather than forced, and reached, in a single century, the same height. They are history's standing reminder that our way was never the only way, and they leave warnings folded inside the wonder, as every great story does. That the connectedness which makes an empire strong, the roads, the relays, the gathered crowds, carries its plagues at the same speed as its orders. That a state built as one sacred knot can be seized by seizing one man. That the past, kept too rich, the dead holding every estate, can starve the living into recklessness. That a house divided into two courts will be entered by a third. The Inca fell to steel and smallpox, yes, but first, and more deeply, they fell to the fracture lines of their own perfection. Strength and vulnerability were the same architecture. They usually are. Yet the longest echo is gentler than any of that, and it is the one to carry towards sleep. The Andean idea itself, older than the empire and alive after it. That the world is not a warehouse but a household. That mountains and fields and the dead and the unborn are all members of it. That everything taken asks something given. That no one works alone, and no one, in a well-kept world, goes hungry while the storehouse stands. Civilizations that believed otherwise have risen higher and fallen harder. This one, broken at the top 5 centuries ago, is still quietly keeping house along the whole spine of a continent. The stones do not argue. They simply remain, level, patient, exactly where they were persuaded to sit, and let the centuries make their point for them. The pass is behind us now, traveller. Ahead, the ridge, the mist, the sleeping city where we began. One last mile, and it is all downhill and slow and kind. Come. The night is nearly perfect for it. And so, traveller, we are back where we began, on the high ridge, above the clouds, in the hour before dawn. The city of pale stone lies around us in the mist, exactly as we left it, the terraces stepping down into the white, the doorways framing the dark peaks, the Emperor's water still whispering down its 16 fountains, as it has whispered every night for 500 years. Nothing here is in any hurry. Nothing here has been in a hurry for a very long time. You may rest now. The journey is done, and it was a long one, and you walked every mile of it well. Let the book of it close gently. Close your eyes, if they are not closed already, and let the last pictures drift past one more time, slower now, softer now, like the mist moving through the empty doorways below, the golden staff sinking into the welcoming earth. Let your shoulders drop and sink a little deeper into the warmth around you, just like that, held the way the valley held the staff. The great road, running quiet under the moon, its stones fitted edge to edge like the days of a calm life, one following another, following another. Breathe in, slowly, the thin, clean air of the heights, and breathe out, longer, and feel the day's weight go out with it, down the terraces, into the clouds, gone. The chasqui has delivered his last message and sleeps by the banked fire of the way station. The weaver has tied off her thread and covered the loom. The storehouses on the hill are full and counted and closed. Nothing is owed tonight. Nothing is wanting. In the great plaza, the sand from the ocean is cool underfoot and empty and at peace. Even the mummified kings have been carried home to their palaces and sit content in the dark, dreaming the long dreams of those whose work is entirely finished. Yours is finished too, for tonight. There is nothing left to hold. The mountains are holding everything now. They are very good at it. They have had practice. Feel how heavy and warm your body has become. Heavy as the sleeping stones, warm as the terrace walls that keep the day's sun for the maize against the frost. The stones of this city have not moved in 500 years, and just now, neither do you need to move. Not a hand, not a thought. The mist is drawing itself over the ridge like a blanket, slowly, kindly, the mountain wrapping its own shoulders, and wrapping the city, and wrapping you. Somewhere below, the river is telling the gorge the same long story it has always told, the one with no ending, only turning. And it needs nothing from you but to be heard the way you hear rain, distantly, sweetly, already half within a dream. The celestial llama is kneeling down at the western rim of the sky to drink. The apus stand their patient watch, white-shouldered in the starlight, lords of a household that never truly fell, keeping everything that was ever given into their keeping. The children, the cities, the bridges of woven grass, and every tired traveller who has ever lain down in the shelter of their slopes. They are keeping you now. You are in the Apu's house tonight, and you are a welcome guest, and the door of the mist is closed against everything that is not rest. Let sleep come the way the sun's light came down the peaks at our beginning, one summit at a time, unhurried, certain, gold. Let it find you the way the boy found the lost city, gently, up the last easy stretch of the path, into the quiet that was kept for you all along. The empire sleeps. The mountains keep it. The water whispers in the fountains, 5 centuries deep, and will still be whispering when you wake. Drift now, traveller, down into the soft dark below the clouds, where the valleys are warm and the storehouses are full, and every road in the 4 quarters of the earth leads home. Sleep well, traveller. Good night.